At my daughter's wedding rehearsal dinner, her future father-in-law looked at my worn suit and declared loudly, "You do not belong in this family. Your daughter is lucky we are letting her step into our world." The entire table fell dead silent. I did not yell. I did not flip the table. I just sat there taking a slow sip of my water. What he did not know was that the very ground his failing company stood on belonged to me. Weeks later, when he was begging for mercy, he realized he had humiliated the wrong man. He learned the hard way. I am Carlton Richards. I am 69 years old and I have spent my entire life building an empire from the dirt up. Before I tell you how I dismantled a dynasty of arrogance, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect cannot be bought with a trust fund. The crystal chandeliers at the exclusive private dining room cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the rehearsal dinner. The room smelled of expensive truffles roasted duck and the suffocating arrogance of the Kensington family. Richard Kensington, the patriarch and CEO of a regional logistics company, sat at the head of the table. He spent the entire evening dominating the conversation, boasting about his golf club memberships, his recent trips to the Swiss Alps, and the impeccable pedigree of his bloodline. I sat quietly at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, observing him the way a hawk observes a loud, oblivious rodent. Richard took a large gulp of his vintage wine, set the glass down with a heavy thud, and turned his gaze toward me. His eyes scanned my faded charcoal suit, lingering on the slightly frayed lapels with blatant disgust. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and made sure everyone in the room was listening. "Carlton, I am going to be brutally honest with you," Richard announced, his voice booming over the soft classical music playing in the background. "You do not belong in this family. We come from wealth, tradition, and high society. You spent your life underneath cars getting grease on your hands. Your daughter is incredibly lucky we are letting her step into our world. Without Braden, she would probably end up living paycheck to paycheck just like you." The clinking of silverware stopped instantly. The waitstaff froze in their tracks, holding trays of champagne. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with second-hand embarrassment and shock. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I slowly picked up my crystal water glass, took a measured sip, and set it down exactly on the coaster. I looked directly into Richard's eyes. I saw the desperate need for superiority masking a deep, pathetic insecurity. He wanted a reaction. He wanted the angry, uncultured stereotype he had built in his mind. I refused to give him that satisfaction. I shifted my gaze to Braden the groom, the man who had promised to protect and honor my daughter. Braden was staring intently at his plate of sea bass, his face flushed red, completely spineless. He did not say a single word to defend his future wife or her father. He just shrank into his expensive tailored tuxedo, a coward hiding behind his father's loud mouth. Then I looked at Aaliyah, my beautiful, brilliant daughter. Her jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle feathering beneath her skin. Her eyes blazed with a fierce, burning anger. She placed her hands on the table and began to push her chair back, fully prepared to stand up and tear Richard apart verbally. But Diane, Richard's wife, quickly reached over and gripped Aaliyah's wrist tightly, digging her manicured nails into my daughter's skin. Now, dear Diane whispered with a venomous fake smile. "Richard is just speaking the truth. There is no need to cause a scene and ruin this lovely evening. Just smile and be grateful." Aaliyah looked at me, her eyes pleading for permission to unleash her fury. I gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was a silent command we had established since she was a little girl. It meant, hold your ground, control your emotions, the time to strike is coming. She took a deep breath, forced her hands into her lap, and sat back down. The Kensingtons mistook her composure for submission. They mistook my silence for weakness. They had no idea they were dancing on the edge of a cliff. Richard continued to smirk, clearly pleased with his perceived victory over the poor, defenseless old man. He thought my faded charcoal suit was a symbol of poverty. He was a fool who judged the book entirely by its weathered cover. He did not know that this suit was priceless to me. 40 years ago, my late wife Valerie bought this exact suit for me with her very first paycheck as a registered nurse. We were young, struggling, and building our lives from nothing in a small apartment. She brought it home in a pristine garment bag, kissed my cheek, and told me I was destined for greatness. I wore this suit to every major milestone of my life. I wore it the day I signed the papers for my first auto repair shop. I wore it the day Aaliyah graduated from college with honors. I wore it to Valerie's funeral, holding her hand one last time. I wore it tonight to honor her memory, bringing a piece of her to our daughter's wedding celebration. Richard Kensington looked at me and saw a retired mechanic surviving on Social Security. He saw a man who spent decades fixing engines and changing oil. That part was true. I was a mechanic. But what I did with the money I earned was a secret I kept hidden from the world. In the early 1990s, while men like Richard were buying depreciating luxury cars and financing lavish vacations, I was quietly buying up foreclosed, abandoned warehouses in the city's worst industrial districts. I invested every spare dime into commercial real estate. Today, those neglected districts are the epicenter of the state's commercial shipping hub. I own 3 industrial parks outright. I am the sole proprietor of a real estate holding company that manages billions in assets. I am a phantom landlord living a quiet, unassuming life while my wealth multiplies in the shadows. The ultimate irony, the detail that made Richard's arrogant speech so deeply pathetic, was the fact that his logistics company did not own their central distribution warehouse. They rented it. And they rented it from my holding company. The very ground Richard built his fragile empire upon was legally mine. He was a tenant mocking the king. The agonizing dinner finally dragged to an end. The head waiter approached the table carrying a silver tray with a sleek black leather folder. He naturally walked toward Richard, assuming the loudest, most boastful man in the room was the one footing the bill. Richard took the folder with a grand theatrical flourish. He opened it, glanced at the total, and let out a loud, mocking chuckle that echoed off the dining room walls. He pulled the itemized receipt from the folder and held it up like a trophy. He then extended his arm and slid the paper directly across the polished mahogany table. It stopped right next to my water glass. $15,000, Richard announced, projecting his voice so every guest waiter and busboy could hear him clearly. We spared no expense for this evening. I hear you spent your whole life fixing broken engines, Carlton. I am absolutely certain a bill like this would bankrupt you and leave you homeless. Do not worry your tired old head about it. I will cover the cost. Consider it my very first act of charity for our new extended family. We always take care of the less fortunate. The disrespect reached its absolute peak. The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air like a foul stench. Diane let out a soft, aristocratic giggle, sipping her champagne. Braden kept his head down, tracing the rim of his glass, utterly terrified to confront his father. Aaliyah was shaking now. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. She opened her mouth to defend my honor, to reject their toxic charity, but I raised my hand slightly, stopping her instantly. I calmly reached for my linen napkin. I wiped my mouth with slow, deliberate precision. I folded the napkin perfectly in half and placed it neatly next to my plate. I looked at the receipt, observing the $15,000 total. Then I looked up at Richard's smug, triumphant face. He thought he had completely crushed me. He thought he had established the hierarchy of this marriage before it even began. I did not say a word. I simply reached into the inner pocket of Valerie's old, faded suit jacket. My fingers brushed against a piece of cold, heavy metal. I pulled out my wallet, preparing to show Richard Kensington exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. I opened my weathered leather wallet, completely ignoring the smug grin plastered across Richard's flushed face. I bypassed the standard debit cards and slipped out a solid, matte black metal card. It carried a distinct heavy weight, a physical manifestation of unrestricted financial power. I placed it squarely on the silver tray next to the receipt. The metallic clink echoed softly across the quiet table. The head waiter, trained to recognize the subtle markers of true wealth, widened his eyes. His professional composure slipped for a fraction of a second as he stared at the card. He knew exactly what it was. It was an account issued by exclusive invitation, only reserved strictly for clients with 8-figure annual spending. He did not even attempt to touch it. Instead, he signaled urgently for the general manager. Within moments, a man in a sharp-tailored suit practically sprinted to our table. The manager bowed deeply, ignoring Richard entirely, and focused his absolute attention on me. "Mr. Richards, it is an absolute honor to have you dine with us tonight," the manager said, his voice trembling slightly with reverence. "I will process this immediately, and I will personally waive the private room fee. Thank you for your continued patronage, sir." Richard's triumphant smirk evaporated, replaced by a look of profound, agonizing confusion. He stared at the black metal rectangle resting on the silver tray as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a blotchy, sickly pale. His carefully constructed narrative of the poor, uneducated black mechanic had just been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "That must be a mistake," Richard stammered, his booming voice suddenly reduced to a weak, raspy squeak. "That is a corporate card from his employer. He is just a mechanic. There is absolutely no way he qualifies for a Tier 1 account." The general manager returned before Richard could finish his pathetic rationalization. He completely bypassed Richard again, treating him like an invisible peasant, and presented the leather folder directly to me along with a heavy gold pen. "Everything is approved, Mr. Richards," the manager said softly. "Please take your time." I signed the receipt with a fluid, practiced motion, leaving a generous $5,000 tip for the waitstaff, who had to endure Richard's insufferable behavior all evening. I closed the folder and pushed it away. Richard was physically trembling now. The veins in his neck bulged, throbbing with a toxic cocktail of public humiliation and pure, unadulterated fury. His fragile ego could not process the reality standing right in front of him. A black man he had spent the entire night belittling a man he deemed entirely beneath his social class had just casually dismissed a $15,000 dinner without batting an eye. His wife Diane sat completely frozen, her jaw practically resting on her diamond necklace. She looked at my faded suit, then at the space where the black card had been her aristocratic brain short-circuiting. Braden remained silent, but his eyes darted nervously between his father and me. He looked absolutely terrified. Aaliyah, however, sat tall. A brilliant, radiant smile graced her face. She knew exactly who her father was, and she relished watching the arrogant patriarch of the Kensington family crumble under the weight of his own profound ignorance. I stood up from the table, buttoning my old charcoal jacket with deliberate slowness. I looked down at Richard, whose face was now burning a bright, furious crimson. "Thank you for the company, Richard," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly level. It was an incredibly revealing evening. "Have a safe drive back to your rented house." I offered my arm to Aaliyah, and we walked out of the private dining room with our heads held high, leaving the Kensington family drowning in a suffocating pool of their own making. The silence we left behind was absolute. I drove back to my modest suburban home, the exact same house where Valerie and I had raised Aaliyah. The quiet working-class neighborhood was a stark contrast to the pretentious circus I had just left. I walked into my home office, turned on the small desk lamp, and poured myself a glass of bourbon. It was past midnight, but my mind was sharp, calculating my next precise move. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Jonathan Pierce answered on the second ring. Jonathan was a ruthless corporate attorney, a legal shark who managed the intricate web of my real estate holding company. He never slept, and he never asked unnecessary questions. "Jonathan, I need a comprehensive financial autopsy by tomorrow morning," I said, staring at a framed photo of Valerie sitting on my desk. "I want everything you can find on Richard Kensington and his logistics company. Dig into his corporate accounts, his personal credit lines, his outstanding loans, and his vendor payment history. Pull his UCC filings and look for leveraged assets. Find the cracks in his foundation. I want to know exactly how much water his sinking ship is taking on." Jonathan typed rapidly on his keyboard in the background. "Consider it done, Carlton. Has this man made the fatal mistake of crossing you?" "He insulted my daughter," I replied coldly. "And he did it while sitting on a throne built entirely on debt. Tear his financial history apart. I want his ledgers stripped bare before the sun comes up." I hung up the phone and took a slow sip of my bourbon. Richard thought he was playing a game of social dominance. He did not realize I was playing a game of total financial annihilation. The sun had barely risen when my phone shattered the morning silence. It was Aaliyah. She was crying, her breath hitching in short, panicked gasps. My protective instincts flared instantly, a primal surge of adrenaline rushing through my veins. I demanded to know what was wrong. She explained that Richard had summoned Braden to his office at the crack of dawn. Richard was utterly consumed by the humiliation he suffered at the rehearsal dinner. His fragile pride demanded immediate retaliation. Because he could not attack me directly, he aimed his venom at my daughter. He had forced Braden to present Aaliyah with a last-minute prenuptial agreement. It was not a standard document designed to protect pre-existing assets. It was a draconian, exploitative contract clearly drafted by a desperate, vindictive man. Aaliyah read the clauses to me over the phone, her voice shaking with disbelief. The contract stipulated that she would have absolutely no claim to any Kensington family assets, which was entirely expected. However, the hidden clauses were terrifying. The document legally bound Aaliyah to absorb 50% of Braden's personal liabilities and debts in the event of a divorce. It completely insulated Braden from his own financial failures while using my daughter as a human shield against bankruptcy. Richard was trying to chain Aaliyah to a sinking ship, ensuring that if his son went down, he would drag my daughter down with him. Braden, being the coward he was, defended the document. He told Aaliyah it was just a standard family protocol to protect their legacy and refused to proceed with the wedding unless she signed it immediately. He weaponized her love, giving her a toxic ultimatum barely 48 hours before she was supposed to walk down the aisle. I gripped the phone so tightly the plastic casing groaned. "Tell him nothing," I instructed my daughter, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "Do not sign a single page. I am coming over right now." I grabbed my keys and headed straight for my vintage 1978 Ford pickup. The engine roared to life with a familiar, gritty rumble. As I drove through the early morning traffic, the sound of Aaliyah sobbing uncontrollably echoed in my mind. She was a fiercely independent woman, a brilliant architect who had built her life with absolute integrity. Hearing her reduced to panicked tears by a cowardly boy and his vindictive father ignited a cold, dangerous fire in my chest. The prenuptial agreement Braden tried to force upon her was not a shield for his family legacy. It was a highly calculated financial trap. They wanted to legally bind my daughter to a sinking ship, shifting the burden of their catastrophic failures onto her pristine record. Richard Kensington thought he was punishing me for the black card incident by attacking my child. He assumed I was just a lucky mechanic who stumbled into some money. He had no idea of the extensive intelligence network I had at my fingertips. Thanks to Jonathan Pierce and his team of forensic accountants, I already had the complete financial autopsy of Braden Kensington sitting on the passenger seat beside me. I pulled up to Braden's luxury downtown apartment complex. It was an overpriced glass tower designed for people who wanted to look wealthy rather than actually build wealth. I bypassed the concierge, took the elevator to the penthouse floor, and knocked on the heavy oak door. Aaliyah opened it. Her eyes were red and swollen, holding a crumpled tissue. She looked incredibly small standing in the massive foyer. I kissed her forehead and stepped inside. Braden was lounging on a genuine leather sofa, sipping an espresso. He wore a crisp designer shirt and an expression of profound irritation. A thick legal document rested on the sleek glass coffee table in front of him. He did not even bother to stand up when I walked into his living room. "Carlton, this is completely unnecessary." Braden sighed, rolling his eyes as if my presence was a major inconvenience. "Aaliyah is overreacting. The prenuptial agreement is just standard procedure. My father insisted on it after you decided to put on that little show at the restaurant last night. It is just business. You need to tell your daughter to sign it so we can move forward with the wedding preparations." I did not raise my voice. I walked directly to the glass coffee table, completely ignoring his arrogant demand. I pulled the thick manila folder from under my arm and slammed it down right on top of his prenuptial agreement. The heavy thud made Braden jump, spilling a few drops of his espresso onto his expensive shirt. "That is an interesting choice of words," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You call it standard procedure to protect your assets. But to protect assets, Braden, you actually have to own some." I flipped the folder open. I had Jonathan highlight the most damning numbers in bright red ink. I looked down at the papers and began to read his absolute ruin aloud. "You currently have $120,000 in unsecured personal debt. It is not tied to a mortgage or a business loan. It is scattered across 3 high-interest credit cards that are completely maxed out. You spent $40,000 on luxury watches to maintain your fake image. You wired $50,000 to offshore sports betting accounts over the last 6 months. And your personal savings account holds exactly $412. You are not protecting a legacy, Braden. You are drowning. And you are trying to use my daughter as a life raft." Braden turned the color of chalk. His smug demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by the sheer terror of a cornered animal. He looked at the documents, recognizing his own hidden bank statements and betting ledgers. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at Aaliyah, who was staring at him with a mixture of profound disgust and absolute betrayal. Aaliyah walked slowly toward the table, her eyes scanning the highlighted red numbers. She looked at the man she was supposed to marry in less than 48 hours. "You lied to me," She whispered, her voice shaking with a new kind of anger. You told me you were building a portfolio. You told me the prenuptial agreement was just to satisfy your father. I turned to my daughter and explained the exact mechanics of his pathetic scheme. He does not just want to satisfy his father, Aaliyah. He wants to harvest your financial identity. Braden's credit score is completely destroyed. He is functionally radioactive to any legitimate bank. But you have a pristine credit score of 810. You have zero debt and a high income. Braden needs your signature on the marriage certificate to secure the massive mortgage for the new house he has been bragging about. He needs your pristine financial record to co-sign the future business loans his father's failing logistics company desperately needs to survive. I pointed at the prenuptial agreement resting under my report. That contract was the final lock on your cage. He planned to use your credit to acquire the funds, but the contract legally forces you to absorb 50% of his liabilities if the marriage inevitably falls apart. He was going to drain your financial lifeblood to cover his gambling debts and his father's failing business, leaving you holding the bag while he walked away clean. Aaliyah stepped back, physically repulsed by the man sitting on the sofa. She realized that every romantic gesture, every talk about their shared future, was meticulously calculated to gain access to her financial stability. Braden was not a partner. He was a parasite looking for a host. The luxurious lifestyle he projected was a complete fabrication entirely funded by high-interest debt and desperate wagers. Braden realized his carefully constructed facade was permanently destroyed. Instead of showing an ounce of remorse or apologizing to the woman he claimed to love, his toxic arrogance took over. The cowardly boy morphed into a vicious, entitled manipulator. He stood up, his face twisted into an ugly, desperate sneer. So what? Braden snapped, crossing his arms defensively. Everyone has a little debt. That is how the real world works, Carlton. But let us talk about the reality of this situation. The wedding is in exactly 48 hours. 400 guests are flying in from across the country. The country club is fully paid for. The caterers, the florists, the media coverage, it is all locked in. He took a step closer to me, trying to use his height to intimidate me. He failed completely. Here is my counteroffer. Braden threatened, a malicious glint in his eyes. You are a rich man, Carlton. I saw that black card. You obviously have deep pockets, so you are going to pay off my $120,000 debt right now, in cash. You are going to clear my slate today. If you do not wire that money into my account by tonight, I will cancel the wedding. I will leave Aaliyah standing at the altar in front of everyone. I will go to every local news outlet and social circle in this city and tell them she had a mental breakdown. I will ruin her reputation so thoroughly she will never be able to show her face in high society again. You pay my debt or I humiliate your precious daughter in front of the entire world. He stood there panting, slightly, immensely proud of his filthy blackmail attempt. He thought he had trapped me. He thought a father's love would force me to submit to his extortion to save my daughter from public humiliation. I looked at Braden. I did not blink. I did not show an ounce of anger. I simply nodded my head. I pulled out my smartphone right there in his pristine, overpriced living room. I opened my encrypted banking application, bypassed the standard security protocols required for such a massive sum, and entered his routing numbers directly from the forensic financial dossier he thought I could never obtain. I authorized a direct wire transfer for exactly $120,000. The confirmation screen lit up green. Seconds later, Braden's phone pinged with a loud, obnoxious chime. A sickening, victorious smile spread across his face as he saw his slate wiped completely clean. He adjusted his designer collar, practically vibrating with unearned relief, entirely convinced he had just successfully extorted a terrified, vulnerable father. The next 48 hours moved with the mechanical, heavily rehearsed precision of a staged theatrical production. The wedding day arrived bathed in golden afternoon sunlight at the most exclusive, ridiculously expensive country club in the state. The floral arrangements were immaculate, the string quartet played with flawless elegance, and the 400 guests mingled in a sea of pastel silk and tailored tuxedos. To the untrained eye, it was the absolute pinnacle of high society perfection, a beautiful celebration of two prominent families coming together. In reality, it was a breathtaking, meticulously maintained lie. The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary swung open, and the opening notes of the bridal chorus echoed through the cavernous hall. I stood beside Aaliyah, my arm hooked gently through hers. She looked absolutely radiant in her flowing white gown, a vision of grace and undeniable strength. But beneath her delicate lace veil, her posture was not that of a nervous, blushing bride. It was the rigid, calculated stance of a soldier preparing to breach enemy lines. As we began our slow, measured walk down the long, white-carpeted aisle, every eye in the room locked onto us. I looked straight ahead at Braden waiting at the altar. He stood tall, looking incredibly smug, believing he had outsmarted us both. He thought he was marrying a naive girl with a pristine credit score he could easily drain. He thought he had forced me to empty my entire life savings just to save her from public humiliation. He was blissfully unaware of the intense closed-door conversation Aaliyah and I had immediately after leaving his apartment 2 days prior. I had not paid his debt to save a wedding. I paid his debt to buy time and to secure the ultimate trap. Aaliyah and I had sat in my truck, and I had laid out a meticulous, ruthless strategy. We brought in Jonathan Pierce that same afternoon. Under his fierce legal guidance, Aaliyah had signed a completely different set of documents, quietly establishing an ironclad financial firewall around her own assets, operating completely outside of Braden's knowledge. We had legally isolated her, preparing her to step into the Kensington family, not as a vulnerable victim, but as a highly shielded Trojan horse. As we approached the altar, Aaliyah turned her head and looked up at me. We did not need to speak. We communicated through a silent language built on decades of absolute trust. Her dark eyes met mine, flashing with a fierce, calculating intelligence. She gave my arm a firm, reassuring squeeze. It was a silent confirmation that our plan was locked in. She was not walking into a trap. She was walking into a war zone, fully armed and fully aware. I handed her over to Braden, forcing a polite paternal smile that hid my absolute disgust. Braden eagerly took her hand, puffing out his chest for the photographers snapping pictures from every angle. They exchanged their vows under the towering stained glass windows. They promised to honor and protect each other in sickness and in health. Aaliyah spoke her vows with perfect, unwavering clarity. She said her "I do" with a bright smile, but the fierce commitment in her voice was not directed toward the man holding her hands. It was a commitment to the absolute destruction of the parasitic family he belonged to. The lavish reception that followed was a masterclass in aristocratic delusion. Richard Kensington held court at the head table, sipping single malt whiskey and accepting endless congratulations as if he had just conquered a small nation. Every time he looked in my direction, sitting quietly at a secondary table, his chest swelled with a sickening, toxic pride. He truly believed he had witnessed my absolute financial ruin. In his arrogant mind, that $120,000 wire transfer was the entirety of my humble, hard-earned retirement fund. He pictured me driving back to a dilapidated house, eating canned soup for the rest of my days, completely bankrupted by my desperate need to keep my daughter in his prestigious social circle. During the toasts, Richard stood up and raised his glass, making a speech filled with subtle, backhanded compliments about how generous he was to welcome a girl from such a simple background into their established lineage. Diane glided through the ballroom in her sequined gown, introducing Aaliyah to their wealthy friends with a condescending pat on the back, presenting her as a fortunate charity case they had generously elevated. Braden paraded around the dance floor with a fresh, arrogant swagger, deeply relieved of his suffocating gambling debts, acting like a self-made titan of industry. They drank my expensive champagne, ate the catered lobster I had secretly funded, and danced on a floor I could have bought 1,000 times over with pocket change. They were practically suffocating in their own profound smugness. They celebrated their brilliant extortion, entirely oblivious to the fact that I had just purchased a premium front-row seat to their impending spectacular collapse. The extravagant honeymoon to the Maldives lasted exactly 14 days. The brutal, unforgiving reality check took less than 24 hours upon their return. The newlyweds had barely unpacked their luggage when the Kensington logistics empire began to violently crack at its fragile seams. Aaliyah called me on a Tuesday morning, her tone completely devoid of panic, replaced instead by a cold, clinical precision. She was sitting in the main conference room of the Kensington corporate office. Richard had summoned an emergency family meeting, and the atmosphere was toxic. His logistics company, already drowning in massive vendor debt and severe financial mismanagement, had just been hit with a catastrophic fatal blow. Their primary operating hub, the massive warehouse that served as the beating heart of their entire distribution network, was facing immediate, non-negotiable eviction. The property management firm holding their commercial lease had abruptly rejected their desperate plea for an extension and was legally threatening to lock down the facility within 30 days. Richard was pacing his office like a trapped, terrified animal, his face pale and slick with panicked sweat. He turned to Aaliyah, completely abandoning his aristocratic charm and refined manners. He demanded that she immediately take out a massive second mortgage on the private lucrative townhouse she had owned long before meeting Braden. He wanted her to extract every ounce of financial equity she had carefully built over the years to inject emergency capital into his failing company. He did not ask her nicely. He framed it as her absolute undeniable duty as the newest member of the Kensington family. "You married my son. You share our burdens," Richard barked at her, his voice dripping with entitled aggressive desperation. "Sign the mortgage papers today or this entire family legacy goes under." The sheer audacity was breathtaking. The conflict had just escalated rapidly from petty extortion to a demand for total ruinous financial sacrifice. What Richard Kensington did not know, and what was about to tear his entire world apart, was the true identity of the phantom landlord who had just denied his warehouse lease. The suffocating atmosphere of the Kensington dining room felt even more oppressive than the rehearsal dinner. Richard had summoned us for a mandatory Sunday evening meal, attempting to project an aura of absolute control despite his rapidly crumbling empire. He sat at the head of the long table, vigorously swirling a glass of expensive scotch, completely ignoring the mounting desperation I had heard in my daughter's voice just days prior. Instead of showing an ounce of panic over the impending warehouse eviction, Richard was loudly bragging to the entire room. He claimed the recent eviction threat was nothing more than a pathetic, desperate negotiation tactic from a coward. According to Richard, the commercial property was managed by some anonymous, senile old landlord who hid behind a corporate shield because he lacked business acumen. Richard boasted to the table that his high-priced legal team was drafting an aggressive, legally binding counteroffer. He fully intended to strong-arm this phantom property owner into selling the entire logistics facility to him for pennies on the dollar. He let out a harsh, grating laugh, praising his own brilliant strategy to exploit the hidden landlord's supposed weakness. He was so deeply entrenched in his own aristocratic delusion that he completely failed to notice the icy, unblinking stare I was aiming at him from across the table. Richard slammed his crystal glass down and turned his predatory gaze directly toward my daughter. He dropped his false, boastful joviality and adopted the tone of a commanding general giving an absolute non-negotiable order. He told Aaliyah the paperwork for the massive second mortgage on her private townhouse would be ready by 9 o'clock the next morning. He demanded she sign it immediately, claiming her massive injection of cash was the exact leverage he needed to execute his hostile takeover of the warehouse property. He framed her financial sacrifice as a glorious required contribution to the Kensington legacy. I set my heavy silver fork down. The sharp clink against the porcelain plate was the only sound in the dead quiet room. "Aaliyah will not be mortgaging her property," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "She will not sign a single document for your failing company. The assets she built before this marriage are hers alone, and they will remain completely untouched." The dining room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Richard's face violently contorted, morphing from smug satisfaction into pure, unadulterated rage. The thick veins on his forehead pulsed visibly under his skin. He stood up from his chair violently, throwing his expensive linen napkin onto the hardwood floor. "You have absolutely no say in this, Carlton," Richard spat, his voice shaking with venomous, uncontrolled fury. "This is family business. This is high-level corporate strategy. You spent your entire pathetic life underneath broken cars with grease permanently stained into your fingernails. You know absolutely nothing about high-stakes leverage asset mobilization, or how the real world of big business actually operates." Braden shrank back into his dining chair, staring intently at his lap, utterly terrified of his father's explosive temper. He offered no support to his new wife. Diane clutched her pearls, gasping dramatically at my perceived insubordination, acting as if a servant had just spoken out of turn. Aaliyah simply shifted her chair closer to mine, presenting a united, unbreakable front. Richard leaned aggressively across the table, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "I allowed you to sit at my table." Richard snarled, his words dripping with deep-seated racist contempt. "I allowed your daughter to marry my son. You paid off a petty little gambling debt and suddenly you think you are a financial titan. We are orchestrating a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate acquisition to secure our regional shipping hub, and you are trying to sabotage it with your small-minded, poverty-stricken mentality. Keep your mouth shut, mechanic. Aaliyah will do what is necessary for the survival of the Kensington Empire, or you will quickly learn exactly how ruthless I can be. I did not break eye contact. I absorbed his screaming, his blatant insults, and his toxic microaggressions without moving a single muscle. He was a desperate, drowning man, thrashing wildly in the water, screaming at the only person holding a life preserver. He truly thought he was educating a foolish old man about the staggering complexities of commercial real estate. He had absolutely no idea he was delivering a lecture on property acquisition to the king of the board. As Richard continued to rant about his grand, pathetic illusions of corporate dominance, my mind briefly flashed back to the early 1990s. While Richard was inheriting a lucrative established logistics business from his wealthy father and rapidly squandering its profits on luxury European vacations and elite country club dues, I was working grueling 16-hour shifts at the garage. My hands were calloused, my knuckles were bruised, and my back ached every single night. But I took every single dollar of overtime, every saved penny from Valerie's long nursing shifts, and I carefully studied the city's zoning maps. I saw the abandoned, decaying industrial sector on the east side of the city. The wealthy elite saw nothing but worthless urban blight and crime. I saw the inevitable, highly profitable future of regional commerce. I purchased my first dilapidated warehouse for a fraction of its actual value. Then I bought the empty lot next to it. Then I bought the entire block. I established Vanguard Holdings, an anonymous, ironclad corporate entity designed specifically to shield my identity from a ruthless business world that constantly underestimated and marginalized men who looked exactly like me. Over 3 dedicated decades, I transformed those rusted steel skeletons into the most coveted high-traffic commercial logistics hub in the entire state. Every major shipping route flowed directly through my properties. Richard Kensington was currently screaming at me about his brilliant plan to financially outsmart an anonymous senile landlord. He was loudly boasting about legally seizing the very building his company's survival utterly depended on. He was completely, hilariously oblivious to the staggering reality that the phantom landlord he intended to bully was sitting right across from his dining table quietly sipping ice water. I owned the concrete beneath his expensive Italian shoes. I owned the steel beams above his head. I owned the absolute entirety of his business future. The dinner ended in a toxic, suffocating silence. Aaliyah and I walked out of the sprawling Kensington estate without a single backward glance. The moment I climbed into the cab of my vintage Ford pickup, I pulled out my secure smartphone and dialed Jonathan Pierce. It was time to stop playing with my food. "Jonathan," I said, staring at the grand illuminated facade of Richard's house through my windshield. "I want the Kensington Logistics lease officially terminated tomorrow morning. Do not just reject the extension request. I want you to execute a full immediate lease termination with extreme prejudice and highly documented cause." I knew exactly what cause to use. During Jonathan's meticulous financial autopsy of the Kensington Company, his private investigators uncovered a highly illegal, wildly irresponsible cost-cutting measure. To save operational money, Richard's logistics fleet had been quietly discharging toxic mechanical runoff and hazardous chemical waste directly into the industrial park's main drainage system for the past 3 years. It was a severe, undeniable violation of both our commercial lease agreement and strict federal environmental regulations. "Draft the formal eviction notice," I instructed Jonathan, my voice hard and absolute in the quiet truck. "Attach the severe environmental damage penalty clauses to the document. Give them exactly 30 days to vacate the premises entirely before we permanently lock the warehouse gates and legally seize their remaining physical assets to cover the massive ecological remediation costs. Hit them with everything we have." At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, the legal hammer dropped with catastrophic, world-shattering force. Jonathan sent the termination documents via certified legal courier directly to Richard's executive desk. The phantom landlord had struck back with lethal, undeniable precision. Less than an hour later, my personal cell phone began to ring frantically. The caller ID flashed Richard's name. The arrogant man who had spent the previous evening screaming that I was a financially illiterate mechanic was now calling me in a state of absolute, unhinged panic. The madness of the villain had officially begun, and his descent into total ruin was accelerating much faster than he could ever comprehend. I let the phone ring out. Richard Kensington was not a man accustomed to being ignored. Less than 40 minutes later, the heavy thud of a frantic, aggressive fist pounded against my solid oak front door. I opened it to find Richard standing on my porch, completely unhinged and sweating profusely. His expensive designer tie was violently loosened, and his normally pristine, heavily styled hair was disheveled from nervously running his hands through it all morning. Without waiting for an invitation, he pushed past me, entirely ignoring basic human decency, and stormed directly into my living room. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a thick, tightly banded stack of $100 bills, and slammed it down onto my glass coffee table. $10,000 in pure, untraceable cash. He panted, his chest heaving with sheer desperation. "That is for you, Carlton. A little signing bonus for a reasonable man. I need you to call your stubborn daughter right now. I need you to convince Aaliyah to sign that second mortgage on her townhouse today. My company just received a catastrophic eviction notice from that cowardly anonymous phantom landlord. I need immediate liquid capital to fight this insane eviction in court, and I need it right now. You take this cash, you fix her terrible attitude, and we pretend last night never happened." I stared at the stack of cash sitting on my table. It was a pathetic, deeply insulting gesture. He truly believed $10,000 was a magnificent fortune enough to instantly buy a father's loyalty and force him to sell out his own daughter's financial future. I reached down slowly, picked up the banded stack of bills, and walked back to the open front door. I looked Richard dead in the eye and casually tossed the entire stack out onto my front lawn. The heavy bundle hit the grass with a dull, unceremonious thud, scattering a few bills into the dirt. "Get your garbage off my property," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet resonance. "And never ever demand anything from my daughter again." Richard froze, his eyes bulging out of his skull as he stared at his rejected bribe lying in the weeds. The fragile aristocratic mask he had worn for decades completely shattered, revealing the ugly, rotting core of the man beneath. His face contorted into a hideous mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. He stepped toward me, his fists clenched at his sides, abandoning every ounce of his supposed high society refinement. "You arrogant, ungrateful nobody," Richard hissed, his voice trembling with a venomous, deep-seated bigotry that had always lurked just beneath his polished surface. "You actually think you are my equal because you manipulated your way into some hidden money. You are nothing but a grease monkey from the slums. People like you do not get to dictate terms to people like me. We built this city. We own the commerce, the country clubs, the entire infrastructure. You just clean up our messes and fix our machines. I generously let your daughter into my pristine family lineage, and this is how you repay my supreme generosity. You think that black card makes you a king. It just makes you a highly decorated peasant playing dress-up. You are completely out of your depth, Carlton. You are swimming in an ocean designed exclusively for white wealth, and I am going to make sure you drown at the bottom of it. I am going to destroy your life and remind you exactly where you belong in the hierarchy of this world." I did not flinch. I absorbed his racist vitriol the same way a solid concrete wall absorbs a light breeze. I watched the spit fly from his mouth, recognizing the sheer, pathetic terror hiding right behind his racial slurs. He was a dying dinosaur, roaring at a meteor. "Your hierarchy is collapsing, Richard," I replied with an icy, unbothered smirk. "And you are standing in my living room begging a peasant for salvation. Now get out of my house before I have you arrested for trespassing." Richard let out a loud, maniacal laugh that echoed off my living room walls. Arrested, he mocked, his eyes wide with a manic, dangerous energy. "You actually think the local police are going to touch me? I play golf with the police chief every Sunday. I single-handedly fund the mayor's re-election campaigns. I own the political machinery of this city, Carlton. Let me show you what real systemic power actually looks like." He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his hands shaking with vindictive rage, and aggressively dialed a number. He put the phone on speakerphone, holding it up between us like a loaded weapon. A voice answered on the second ring, greeting him with familiar, subservient warmth. Mayor Thomas Richard barked, his tone immediately shifting into a practiced, authoritative command that expected instant obedience. "I need an immediate aggressive favor. I am currently standing inside the residence of a Carlton Richards on the east side. I have credible first-hand reason to suspect highly illicit, unrecorded financial operations occurring on this property right now. He is flashing Tier 1 credit lines with zero verifiable corporate income, and I strongly suspect massive tax fraud, money laundering, or racketeering. I need the city's zoning and financial inspection units to tear this property apart immediately. Make an absolute example of him today. The mayor, desperate to please his wealthiest political donor, did not even ask for a shred of proof. Right away, Richard the mayor said through the speaker, his voice dripping with compliance, "We cannot have unregulated criminal activities threatening our good neighborhoods. I will send a specialized municipal task force down there within the hour." Richard ended the call, a wicked, triumphant grin stretching across his bright red face. "Let us see how your little black card stops a full municipal raid," he sneered, turning on his heel and marching out the door to collect his dirty money from my lawn. Richard was not bluffing about his corrupt municipal influence. Less than 2 hours after he sped away from my driveway in a cloud of exhaust, 3 unmarked white sedans abruptly parked along my curb, blocking my driveway. 5 aggressive city inspectors, accompanied by 2 armed police officers with their hands resting on their holsters, marched up to my front porch brandishing a highly expedited, extremely broad search warrant. They claimed they were officially investigating anonymous reports of an illegal, unlicensed commercial enterprise operating out of a residential zone, combined with allegations of severe structural code violations. They forced their way into my home, tearing through my personal filing cabinets, aggressively photographing my home office, and attempting to confiscate my personal hard drives. It was a blatant, highly coordinated intimidation tactic designed entirely to humiliate me in front of my neighbors and completely paralyze my daily life. I sat calmly in my leather armchair, sipping a fresh cup of black coffee, quietly allowing them to search every inch of the room. I knew my personal ledgers were completely flawless, and the real corporate architecture of Vanguard Holdings was buried deeply behind layers of impenetrable legal shielding managed by Jonathan Pierce. They would find absolutely nothing but a retired mechanic's perfectly clean tax returns. However, while I was dealing with Richard's pathetic municipal circus, a much more insidious, highly illegal crime was unfolding across town. Back at the luxury penthouse, Braden Kensington was acting entirely on his own desperate initiative. He knew his father's logistics company was facing imminent destruction, and his own crippling gambling debts were still threatening to ruin him. Aaliyah had explicitly and firmly refused to sign the second mortgage documents that morning. But Braden, driven by absolute cowardice and mounting financial terror, decided he no longer needed her consent. While Aaliyah was securely locked in her home office conducting a virtual architectural presentation for a major client, Braden quietly slipped into her private study. He bypassed the combination lock on her personal filing safe, frantically rummaging through her highly sensitive financial documents. He stole her original birth certificate, her physical social security card, and her 3 most recent pristine W-2 tax statements. He stuffed the stolen documents into his designer leather briefcase, his hands slick with nervous, guilty sweat. He was entirely prepared to march down to the central bank branch that very afternoon and fraudulently forge his new wife's signature to secure a $500,000 line of credit himself, effectively stealing her identity to save his own skin. The municipal inspectors were still flipping through my perfectly organized, thoroughly legal tax returns when my private encrypted smartphone vibrated intensely in my pocket. It was not a call from Jonathan Pierce or another desperate threat from Richard Kensington. It was an automated high-priority alert from the elite identity protection and financial monitoring service I had quietly attached to Aaliyah's social security number years ago. I pulled the phone out and read the bold red text illuminating the screen. A hard credit inquiry was actively being processed at the central downtown branch of the First National Bank. Someone was currently attempting to initiate a $500,000 second mortgage under Aaliyah's name. I knew instantly she was not at the bank. She was at her home office presenting a major architectural project. The absolute sheer audacity of Braden Kensington had just escalated from pathetic financial manipulation to blatant, highly illegal identity theft. I stood up, completely ignoring the confused city inspector holding my electricity bill. I told the lead officer they could lock the door when they finished finding absolutely nothing, and I walked straight out to my truck. I dialed Aaliyah, told her to drop whatever she was doing, and instructed her to meet me at the bank immediately. I pulled my vintage Ford pickup into the loading zone right in front of the massive glass doors of the First National Bank. Aaliyah arrived mere seconds later, stepping out of an Uber with a look of pure murderous rage on her face. We did not stop at the reception desk. We did not wait to be announced. I knew the layout of this branch intimately, considering my holding company stored a significant portion of its liquid assets in their commercial vaults. I marched straight past the protesting security guards and headed directly toward the senior loan officer's suite at the back of the building. I threw the heavy frosted glass door open without knocking. The heavy thud of this door hitting the wall made the two men inside jump out of their skin. Braden was sitting comfortably in a plush leather chair wearing a perfectly tailored suit, holding a silver Mont Blanc pen. A massive stack of mortgage documents rested on the polished mahogany desk in front of him. Sitting across from him was the senior loan director, a man who looked completely oblivious to the felony unfolding in his office. Braden froze the silver pen hovering mere inches above the signature line. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He stared at me, then his eyes shifted to his wife standing right beside me, radiating a cold, lethal fury. "Braden," Aaliyah said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, absolute whisper. "Put the pen down." The loan director stood up quickly, adjusting his tie, clearly flustered by the sudden intrusion. "Excuse me, you cannot just barge into a private financial meeting," he stammered defensively. "We are in the middle of closing a joint mortgage application for Mr. and Mrs. Kensington." I stepped forward and looked the loan director dead in the eye. "That man is Braden Kensington," I stated firmly, pointing a calloused finger at my cowardly son-in-law. "But the woman whose name is on those documents is standing right next to me. She has not authorized a single page of this application. You are currently facilitating massive coordinated identity theft, and if you process that paperwork, I will personally ensure this bank faces a catastrophic federal investigation." The loan director looked at Aaliyah, then down at the forged authorization forms Braden had already submitted, and finally at the stolen birth certificate and social security card resting on the desk. He realized instantly he had been completely duped. He snatched the documents away from Braden's side of the desk as if they were suddenly on fire. Braden dropped the silver pen. It clattered loudly against the wood. His carefully constructed web of lies had just collapsed in the most spectacular, legally damning way possible. He was trapped in a small glass room with no exit, holding the smoking gun of a major federal crime. Braden's arrogant, entitled demeanor vanished into thin air. The reality of his actions crashed down on him with crushing gravity. He slid out of the plush leather chair and physically dropped to his knees right there on the carpeted floor of the bank office. He reached out desperately, trying to grab Aaliyah's hand, tears of pure panic streaming down his flushed face. "Aaliyah, please, you have to understand," Braden sobbed, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "My father forced me into this. His company is going under. I owe so much money. I was going to pay it back. I swear I was going to pay it all back. Please do not call the police. I will go to prison." Aaliyah snatched her hand away in absolute disgust, stepping back to avoid his touch. I looked down at him, feeling nothing but profound contempt. "Let me clearly explain exactly what you just attempted, Braden," I said, my voice sharp and clinical. "You stole highly sensitive personal identification documents. You brought them across state banking lines. You presented them to a federally insured financial institution to fraudulently secure a $500,000 line of credit. Under Title 18 of the United States Code that constitutes severe identity theft, wire fraud, and federal bank fraud, that is not a slap on the wrist. That is a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. You did not just make a mistake to help your father. You knowingly committed a severe felony that would have financially ruined my daughter for the rest of her life. You are a criminal." Aaliyah looked down at the weeping, pathetic man she had married just weeks ago. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a crisp, blank legal pad she had grabbed from her home office desk. She threw it onto the floor right in front of his knees. "I am not calling the police right now," Aaliyah declared, her voice completely devoid of any affection or mercy. "Pick up that pen, Braden. You are going to write a full, detailed confession of exactly what you did today. You will list every stolen document. You will state clearly that you acted alone and with the intent to commit financial fraud against me. You will sign it, and you will date it. If you refuse, my father calls the federal authorities before we leave this room and you leave this bank in handcuffs." Braden scrambled to grab the pen. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold it straight. He wept uncontrollably as he scribbled out his full confession, documenting his own felony out of sheer absolute terror of immediate imprisonment. He handed the signed paper up to Aaliyah, his head bowed in total submission. We took the confession, turned around, and walked out of the bank, leaving him sobbing on the floor. News of the spectacularly failed bank fraud reached Richard Kensington within the hour. Braden, terrified and broken, called his father looking for salvation. Instead of showing concern for his son's legal jeopardy, Richard flew into a blind, unprecedented rage. His son had failed to secure the emergency funds, his company was still facing imminent eviction, and his attempt to use the city inspectors against me had yielded absolutely zero leverage. Cornered, bankrupt, and losing his mind, Richard decided he had to play his final desperate hand. He instructed his corporate lawyers to demand an immediate mandatory face-to-face meeting with the anonymous landlord of Vanguard Holdings. Richard was going to bet everything on one last aggressive confrontation, completely unaware of the absolute shock waiting for him in that boardroom. The executive boardroom of Vanguard Holdings occupied the entire top floor of the city's most prestigious commercial tower. It was a space designed to intimidate, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling industrial districts below and a massive black marble conference table. Richard Kensington marched into the room flanked by two highly stressed corporate attorneys. He was sweating, his tailored suit clinging uncomfortably to his frame, but he furiously attempted to project his usual aristocratic dominance. He dropped his expensive leather briefcase onto the marble surface with a loud, aggressive thud. He paced the length of the room like a caged tyrant, checking his gold Rolex every few seconds. When a junior associate quietly entered to place a pitcher of ice water on the table, Richard snapped. He slammed his fist down hard on the marble, causing the glasses to rattle. "I did not come here for water," Richard barked, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous space. "I came here to settle a severe misunderstanding. Go find this anonymous coward playing games with my commercial lease and tell him Richard Kensington demands to see him right this second. I am not waiting around for a faceless bureaucrat." The heavy double doors at the far end of the boardroom swung open with a smooth, silent glide. I stepped into the room. I was not wearing a bespoke Italian suit or flashing a gold watch. I was wearing the exact same faded charcoal suit Valerie had bought me 40 years ago, the very same suit Richard had ruthlessly mocked at the wedding rehearsal dinner. My posture was straight, my expression an unreadable stony mask. I walked slowly across the plush carpet, the silence in the room suddenly stretching out like a pulled rubber band. Richard stopped his frantic pacing and stared at me. His arrogant brain, completely clouded by a lifetime of systemic prejudice and unearned superiority, failed to process the reality of my presence. He did not see a threat. He did not see a corporate rival. He looked at my weathered face, my black skin, and my old suit, and his mind instantly defaulted to the most degrading, predictable stereotype imaginable. He genuinely believed the building management had sent up a member of the maintenance staff to clean up his mess. "What are you doing here, Carlton?" Richard asked, letting out a sharp, exasperated scoff. "Did my son send you here to beg for mercy after that pathetic stunt you pulled at the bank? Because if he did, you are completely wasting your time. I am in the middle of a high-stakes corporate negotiation that you could not possibly comprehend." I did not say a word. I simply continued walking until I reached the head of the marble table, standing directly opposite him. Richard rolled his eyes, utterly annoyed by my silence. He gestured dismissively toward the corner of the room where a premium espresso machine sat untouched. "You know what, since you somehow managed to sneak your way up to the executive floor, make yourself useful," Richard commanded, speaking to me exactly as one would speak to a disobedient servant. "Go over to that machine and pour me a black coffee. Make it strong. I have a long morning ahead of me dealing with these real estate vultures, and I do not have the patience to look at your miserable face while I do it. Go on, move." His two corporate lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They did not know who I was, but they could read the palpable, heavy shift in the room's atmosphere. They recognized the cold, terrifying stillness of a man holding all the leverage. Richard, however, was completely blind to it. He snapped his fingers at me twice, repeating his demand for a cup of coffee with extreme prejudice. I stood motionless at the head of the table. I looked at his snapping fingers, then up to his flushed, angry face. "I do not pour coffee." "Richard?" I said, my voice quiet but carrying a lethal absolute authority. "But I do collect rent." Before Richard could process my statement or hurl another racist insult, the boardroom doors opened a second time. Jonathan Pierce strode into the room carrying a thick, pristine legal binder. Jonathan radiated an aura of pure, predatory legal power. He ignored Richard's lawyers entirely, walked directly to my side, and respectfully placed the binder on the marble table right in front of me. "Good morning, Mr. Richards," Jonathan said, bowing his head slightly in a display of absolute professional deference. "All the eviction documents are prepared and ready for your final signature." Jonathan then turned his sharp, predatory gaze toward Richard. "Mr. Kensington, Jonathan announced, his voice projecting a crisp, undeniable finality. Allow me to officially introduce you to the Chief Executive Officer and sole proprietor of Vanguard Holdings. This is Mr. Carlton Richards. He is the exclusive owner of the Eastside Commercial Industrial Park. He owns the warehouse your logistics company currently occupies. He owns the shipping routes your trucks rely on to operate. He owns the actual pavement beneath your tires. He is the anonymous landlord you have spent the last 2 weeks threatening to bully into submission. Jonathan opened the binder, revealing the original deed to the warehouse property bearing my unmistakable legally binding signature alongside a mountain of state-certified ownership documents. The paper trail was absolute bulletproof and completely undeniable. Mr. Richards is not here to serve you coffee, Jonathan stated, his tone dripping with professional disdain. He is not a messenger, and he is certainly not your subordinate. He is here to personally oversee the total liquidation and eviction of your failing enterprise due to your severe, highly documented environmental violations. The physical transformation of Richard Kensington was a breathtaking spectacle to witness. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, ghostly white. His jaw literally dropped, his mouth hanging open in a silent, agonizing scream of pure realization. The man he had ruthlessly mocked for having grease on his hands, the man he deemed entirely unfit to sit at his dining table, the man he tried to have raided by corrupt city officials, was the absolute master of his financial universe. Richard staggered backward, hitting the edge of the conference table to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. His legs visibly shook. He looked at the deed, then up at my face, searching desperately for any sign that this was a cruel, elaborate prank. But my eyes offered absolutely no mercy. I was a towering wall of cold, unyielding reality. The sheer psychological weight of his profound miscalculation broke his mind completely. The refined high society patriarch vanished instantly. He transitioned rapidly from profound shock into the chaotic, feral state of a cornered animal. His breathing became ragged and shallow. He began to sweat profusely, large drops forming on his brow and staining the collar of his expensive shirt. "This is a fraud!" Richard suddenly screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. He slammed his fists onto the table, spittle flying from his lips. "This is an illegal setup. You cannot possibly own that property. You are a mechanic. You are a nobody. I will not let you steal my family legacy." His lawyers immediately jumped up, trying to physically restrain him, terrified of the massive legal liability their client was actively creating. But Richard violently shoved them away. He was completely out of his mind, completely trapped, and looking for any possible way to inflict damage before he was completely annihilated. He realized in that agonizing moment that every single insult he had hurled at me, every attempt to humiliate my daughter, and every toxic display of his unearned superiority had been driving nails directly into his own coffin. The man he had treated like absolute garbage was the very executioner holding the axe over his fragile, bankrupt empire. Richard violently shoved his own corporate attorneys away, refusing to accept the catastrophic reality standing right in front of him. He straightened his ruined, sweat-stained suit jacket with trembling hands. He took a ragged, desperate breath, and his pure survival instinct instantly mutated into a poisonous, unadulterated malice. He reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a sleek silver tablet. He slid the device across the cold, black marble table toward me. He claimed he had an ultimate insurance policy against his eviction. With a wicked, desperate sneer, he explained that over the last few weeks he had paid a team of underground professionals to digitally manipulate hundreds of images. He had manufactured highly convincing, entirely fabricated, and deeply compromising photographs of my daughter Aaliyah. He threatened to release these forged, explicit images to every major architectural firm in the country, every high-profile client she managed, and every local news outlet in the state. He promised to digitally slaughter her immaculate professional reputation and turn her into a public pariah. His terms were incredibly simple and profoundly disgusting. He demanded that I immediately drop the eviction notice, renew his commercial logistics lease at a massive financial discount, and sign a non-disclosure agreement to forget this ever happened. If I refused, he would press a button and destroy my daughter's life before she even had a chance to build it. He smiled a sickening, predatory grimace, genuinely believing he had finally found my breaking point and backed me into an inescapable corner. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I did not reach across the wide marble table to wrap my hands around his throat, no matter how intensely my paternal instincts demanded absolute violence. I simply looked down at the silver tablet, then back up at his flushed, sweat-drenched face. I gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod to Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan did not say a single word. He simply pressed a small button on a remote control resting in the palm of his hand. The automated blackout blinds in the executive boardroom silently descended instantly, plunging the massive room into a dramatic, heavy darkness. A large high-definition projector screen lowered from the ceiling directly behind my chair. The high-powered projector mounted above us hummed to life, cutting through the shadows. The screen illuminated the entire room with a crystal-clear, razor-sharp video recording. It was not a fabricated, digitally manipulated lie like the one Richard held. It was cold, hard, undeniable reality. The footage showed the interior of the senior loan director's office at the First National Bank from just a few days ago. The high-fidelity audio system in the boardroom kicked in, broadcasting the unmistakable, pathetic sound of a grown man weeping uncontrollably. The camera angle perfectly captured Braden Kensington physically dropping to his knees onto the carpeted floor. It showed him scrambling to grab a silver pen, his entire body shaking with absolute terror. Every single word of his pathetic, groveling confession echoed off the marble walls of the boardroom. The audio captured Braden openly admitting to stealing Aaliyah's original birth certificate, her social security card, and her private tax returns. It captured him confessing to the bank director that he was knowingly committing severe federal bank fraud and identity theft to secure a $500,000 line of credit to save his father's failing business. It showed my daughter standing over him like a supreme judge delivering a death sentence, forcing him to write out his own criminal demise on a yellow legal pad. Richard stared at the massive screen, his eyes wide with absolute unadulterated horror. He watched his only son, the supposed heir to the Grand Kensington legacy, crying like a terrified child and legally hanging himself with his own hand. The smug, victorious blackmail threat completely evaporated from Richard's throat. He was staring at the undisputed destruction of his family bloodline. Jonathan paused the video right on the exact frame where Braden signed his full name to the written confession, leaving the damning image frozen on the massive screen. I folded my hands on the marble table, letting the heavy silence crush whatever remaining hope Richard had left in his body. "You truly thought you could walk into my building and hold a fabricated digital gun to my head?" I said, my voice cutting through the dark room like a serrated blade. "Let me explain a fundamental principle of survival to you, Richard. It is a lesson I learned a very long time ago while building this empire from the absolute dirt. You never, under any circumstances, negotiate with a hostage taker. You never compromise with a blackmailer. If you give a predator a single inch, they will inevitably take your life. If you press that button and release a single fabricated image of my daughter to the public, I will not hesitate. I will not sue you for civil defamation. I will immediately hand that unedited high-definition video footage directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I will hand the physical signed confession to the United States District Attorney. I will personally ensure that your cowardly son is indicted on multiple federal felony charges before the sun sets today. Identity theft and bank fraud carry mandatory minimum sentences in federal penitentiaries. Braden will not survive a single week in that environment. I will ensure he serves every single day of a 10-year sentence, and I will personally stand in the courtroom to watch him be taken away in handcuffs. The choice is entirely yours, Richard. You can take your fake pictures and walk out of my building right now, accepting your legal eviction and your total financial ruin with whatever microscopic shred of dignity you have left. Or you can try to destroy my daughter, and I will permanently destroy your son's freedom." Richard was completely and utterly broken. The psychological weight of the ultimate checkmate crushed him physically. He stumbled backward, his breathing erratic and violently panicked. He looked at the frozen image of his weeping son on the projector screen, then looked back at my cold, unyielding face. He did not say another word. He violently grabbed his leather briefcase off the table, completely abandoning the silver tablet containing his empty threats. He turned around and practically ran out of the boardroom, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the plush carpet. He sprinted down the hallway, leaving his two highly paid corporate attorneys sitting at the table in stunned, deeply embarrassed silence. They quickly packed their legal briefs, offered Jonathan a brief apologetic nod of total professional defeat, and hurried out after their deranged client. Once Richard reached the safety of his luxury sedan in the underground parking garage, his overwhelming panic rapidly curdled into a desperate, toxic spite. If he could not win through legal maneuvering or dirty blackmail, he decided he would burn the entire city to the ground. He pulled out his smartphone, his hands shaking with vindictive rage. He still possessed a shrinking network of corrupt political connections and deeply unethical media contacts. He made a calculated, malicious decision. He was going to drain the absolute last remaining drops of liquid capital from his failing logistics company. He was going to use every single available dollar to bribe local journalists, tabloid editors, and influential social media commentators. He began orchestrating a massive, highly funded public smear campaign. He intended to frame Vanguard Holdings and Carlton Richards not as legitimate business entities, but as a predatory, ruthless slumlord syndicate utilizing illegal mafia tactics to unlawfully extort a proud, traditional local business. He wanted to weaponize public outrage, hoping to create a media circus so volatile that city officials would be forced to intervene on his behalf to save his company. He was preparing to launch an all-out media war, entirely unaware that I had already anticipated his next pathetic move and was perfectly positioned to completely cut off his financial oxygen supply. The Sunday morning edition of the city's largest independent newspaper landed on my driveway with a heavy thud. The front page featured a massive, deliberately darkened photograph of me, completely out of context, beneath a sensationalized, glaring headline. It read, "Predatory Slumlord Syndicate Extorts Historic Local Business." Richard's last desperate injection of cash into the corrupt local media machine had worked perfectly. The article was a masterpiece of fabricated outrage, painting Vanguard Holdings as an illegal mafia operation relentlessly targeting a proud, upstanding, traditional family enterprise. Social media immediately ignited with manufactured fury. The comment sections were flooded with the exact kind of systemic racial vitriol Richard had so eagerly weaponized against me in my own living room. The digital outrage quickly bled into physical reality. I walked out onto my front porch holding my morning coffee and stopped. The entire lower half of my solid oak front door was dripping with slimy, foul-smelling yellow yolk. Discarded, shattered eggshells littered my welcome mat. A group of anonymous cowards emboldened by Richard's highly funded propaganda had driven past my house in the dead of night to vandalize my property. They wanted me to feel intimidated, isolated, and afraid in my own neighborhood. I did not call the police to report the vandalism. I did not log on to social media to post a defensive, emotional rebuttal. I simply walked over to my garage, pulled out my heavy-duty power washer, and connected it to the garden hose. I stood on my front lawn in the crisp morning air and systematically blasted the rotten egg yolk off my front door. I watched the yellow slime dilute into the soapy water and wash down the concrete driveway into the gutter exactly where Richard's fabricated media circus belonged. I turned off the water, wiped my hands on an old rag, and pulled my secure smartphone from my pocket. I dialed Jonathan Pierce. He answered immediately, already well aware of the front-page article circulating through the city's financial districts. "Good morning, Carlton." Jonathan said, his voice completely unbothered by the media storm. "I am already drafting a massive defamation lawsuit. We can freeze the publication's assets by Tuesday." "Cancel the defamation suit." "Jonathan," I replied calmly, walking back into my pristine, quiet kitchen. "Let them print whatever lies they want. The public forgets a newspaper article in 48 hours. I am not interested in fighting a public relations battle with a drowning man. I am interested in accelerating his drowning. I want to shift our strategy from real estate eviction to total financial acquisition." I sat down at my kitchen island and laid out the new protocol. Richard emptied his remaining operational capital to fund this pathetic smear campaign. That means he has officially defaulted on his primary commercial credit lines. I want you to contact the senior commercial lending officers at every single financial institution currently holding debt for the Kensington Logistics Company. I know for a fact they are heavily leveraged with First National Bank and 2 other regional lenders. Those banks are watching this media circus, and they know Richard is a massive, highly toxic liability. They want that bad debt off their books immediately. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I want Vanguard Holdings to purchase every single outstanding loan, every piece of leveraged corporate debt, and every unsecured line of credit attached to Richard Kensington and his company. Buy the debt for pennies on the dollar if you have to, but acquire all of it. Do not leave a single financial thread in the hands of another institution. Use our anonymous shell corporations to execute the buyouts so Richard does not see the wave coming until it crashes over him. I want absolute control over his accounts payable. I want his equipment, leases, his fleet financing, and the secondary mortgage on his corporate headquarters transferred directly into our portfolio. Let him think his media strategy is working, while we quietly buy the very ground he stands on. Call me when the acquisitions are finalized. I hung up the phone. Richard wanted a war of attrition, but I was about to introduce him to the devastating reality of corporate siege warfare. The financial technique I deployed was a ruthless, highly sophisticated corporate maneuver known as a predatory debt buyout. When a company like Richard's logistics firm begins to spiral toward inevitable bankruptcy, their corporate debt becomes heavily distressed. Traditional banks despise distressed debt. It ruins their quarterly risk assessments and attracts unwanted federal regulatory scrutiny. They are overwhelmingly eager to offload those toxic liabilities to third-party investment firms at a steeply discounted rate just to wipe their ledgers clean. By aggressively purchasing the entirety of Richard's distressed corporate debt through my anonymous holding companies, Vanguard Holdings fundamentally altered the legal dynamic between us. I was no longer merely his frustrated commercial landlord demanding a warehouse eviction. I officially became his supreme overriding financial creditor. Within 72 hours, Jonathan Pierce had successfully executed the massive acquisition strategy. Vanguard Holdings now legally owned the loans financing Richard's entire fleet of transport trucks. We owned the operational credit lines that funded his employee payroll. We owned the massive debt tied directly to his personal corporate headquarters. The implications were absolute and catastrophic for the Kensington family. As the primary debt holder of a company in active default, I now possessed the unilateral legally binding authority to bypass standard eviction courts completely. I held the absolute power to demand immediate full repayment of all outstanding loans. When Richard inevitably failed to produce the millions of dollars he owed, I would have the legal right to seize, liquidate, and auction off every single asset his family had spent 3 generations building. I did not just hold the keys to his warehouse. I held the leash to his entire family legacy. I was going to financially dismantle him piece by piece. While I was systematically locking down the Kensington family's financial destruction, my daughter was executing her own decisive exit strategy. Aaliyah had returned to the luxury penthouse she briefly shared with Braden. The illusion of their marriage was permanently shattered. She pulled 2 large suitcases from the closet and began methodically packing her personal belongings, determined to extract herself from that toxic environment before the entire family collapsed into bankruptcy. She moved with cold efficiency, refusing to shed another tear for a man who had tried to steal her future. Braden walked into the master bedroom and saw her packing. The reality of his isolation finally snapped whatever fragile thread of sanity he had left. His father's company was ruined, his extortion plot had failed, and now his wealthy, successful wife was walking out the door. He flew into a blind, terrifying panic. He darted out of the bedroom, aggressively slammed the heavy oak front door of the penthouse, and engaged the deadbolt. He engaged the secondary chain lock and physically pocketed the only set of keys. He trapped my daughter inside. Aaliyah demanded he open the door, maintaining her composure, but Braden was completely unhinged. He paced the foyer like a rabid animal, screaming that she could not abandon him. He pulled out his phone and dialed my number, his breathing ragged and heavy. I answered on the first ring. "I have her, Carlton." Braden screamed into the phone, his voice echoing loudly in the enclosed space of the locked apartment. "Aaliyah is not leaving this penthouse. You're going to call your lawyers right now. You're going to cancel the warehouse eviction, and you are going to forgive every single dollar of debt my father owes you. If you do not guarantee our financial safety right this second, I swear you will never see your daughter again." He thought he was taking control. He did not realize he had just crossed a fatal, unforgivable line. The line went dead. Braden had made the ultimate mistake. He had taken his pathetic, crumbling financial war and escalated it into a direct physical threat against my own flesh and blood. I did not call the local police. I did not call my lawyer, Jonathan Pierce. I simply walked out of my house, got into my vintage 1978 Ford pickup truck, and turned the heavy ignition. The large engine roared to life with a gritty mechanical growl. I shifted the truck into gear and drove toward the downtown district with cold, absolute, and highly calculated purpose. The luxury apartment complex where Braden lived was surrounded by a tall, ornamental wrought iron security gate designed entirely to keep the real world out. I did not stop at the electronic keypad. I did not roll down my window to wait for the concierge to grant me access. I slammed my heavy work boot down hard on the accelerator. The massive steel bumper of my vintage truck collided violently with the center of the iron gate. The decorative metal buckled and snapped under the sheer, unyielding force of the impact, screeching loudly as the two heavy doors were forcefully ripped completely off their hinges. I drove straight over the mangled metal, parked the truck directly in front of the lobby doors, and stepped out of the vehicle. The terrified concierge backed away from his marble desk with his hands raised in the air as I marched through the lobby. I did not say a single word to him. I stepped into the main elevator, hit the button for the penthouse floor, and waited with absolute terrifying stillness. The brass doors chimed open. I walked down the quiet, thickly carpeted hallway and stood directly in front of Braden's heavy oak front door. I did not knock. I took a measured step back, planted my dominant foot firmly into the floor, and delivered a devastating, concentrated kick directly next to the deadbolt mechanism. The heavy oak splintered instantly. The metal lock tore through the wooden doorframe with a loud, violent crack, and the door swung violently inward, slamming against the interior foyer wall. I stepped inside. The apartment was in total chaos. Aaliyah stood perfectly composed near the kitchen island, her two packed suitcases resting by the door. Braden was standing in the center of the living room, his face flushed bright red, his eyes wide with a mixture of sheer shock and unhinged feral aggression. He could not believe I had bypassed his security and physically breached his heavily fortified fortress in a matter of minutes. Seeing me standing there, realizing his ultimate hostage strategy had failed spectacularly, Braden completely lost his mind. He let out a primal, desperate yell and charged across the living room directly at me. He was young, privileged, and fueled entirely by raw adrenaline and blinding panic. He swung his right arm in a wild, uncoordinated haymaker intending to strike my face. He assumed my advanced age made me a fragile, easy target. He was about to learn a brutal, deeply painful lesson about my past. Before I bought my first commercial warehouse, before I ever turned a heavy wrench in a civilian garage, I served 2 brutal combat tours in the United States Marine Corps. You do not ever forget the deep muscle memory of close quarters combat. You do not lose the trained instinct to instantly neutralize a hostile physical threat. As Braden lunged forward, I smoothly sidestepped his clumsy telegraphing punch. I grabbed his extended right arm by the wrist, twisting it sharply outward to forcefully lock his elbow joint in place. With a fluid, highly practiced motion, I stepped completely into his center of gravity, sweeping his legs out from under him while simultaneously driving his twisted arm downward. Braden slammed into the hardwood floor with a massive, breathless thud. The air was violently forced out of his lungs. Before he could even attempt to recover or roll away, I drove my knee firmly into the center of his upper spine, pinning him entirely to the ground. I applied just enough upward twisting pressure on his locked arm to let him know that any sudden movement would result in a permanently dislocated shoulder. Braden cried out in sharp, immediate pain. He stopped struggling instantly, completely paralyzed by the sudden application of overwhelming physical force. I held him there against the floorboards, breathing evenly, completely unbothered by the brief physical exertion. "You threatened the wrong family, Braden," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, deadly whisper right next to his ear. The loud sound of approaching sirens wailed through the open, broken doorway. The concierge had predictably called the authorities the exact moment I smashed my truck through the front security gate. Heavy tactical footsteps pounded down the hallway. 3 armed police officers burst into the penthouse, their weapons drawn and leveled directly at the center of the living room. I immediately released my hold on Braden, raised my empty hand slowly in the air to clearly show I was unarmed, and took 2 calculated steps backward. Braden remained on the floor, groaning pathetically and holding his bruised shoulder. Seconds later, Richard Kensington shoved his way past the armed officers. Braden must have called his father in a blind panic right before he called me to issue his ransom demand. Richard took one look at his son crying on the floor, the splintered oak doorframe, and me standing calmly in the living room. His face contorted into a mask of pure, vindictive triumph. "Arrest this man right now," Richard demanded, shouting at the highest-ranking police officer and pointing an aggressive finger directly at my chest. He just committed a violent, unprovoked home invasion. He destroyed the property gate, broke down the door of my son's private residence, and viciously assaulted him. This is aggravated assault and felony breaking and entering. I want him in handcuffs immediately. You all saw the damage. He is a violent, unstable criminal. The police officers kept their hands resting near their holsters, clearly tense from the highly chaotic scene. The commanding officer turned his attention to me loudly, demanding a strict legal explanation for the physical destruction and the violent altercation. Richard smiled a sickening, arrogant smile. He genuinely thought he had finally won. He thought he had the perfect, undeniable legal pretext to throw me in a jail cell, ruin my reputation, and completely derail my hostile financial takeover of his failing logistics company. I did not say a single word to the police officers. I did not need to defend my actions verbally. I simply looked over at my daughter. Aaliyah stepped forward from the kitchen island, her posture radiating absolute authority. She reached up to her neck and unclasped a heavy modern silver pendant she had been wearing all morning. It was not just a piece of expensive designer jewelry. As a high-level architect who frequently surveyed hazardous and occasionally hostile construction sites, Aaliyah routinely utilized advanced wearable technology. Embedded directly into the dark center of the silver pendant was a high-definition wide-angle microcamera paired with a continuous active audio recording unit. Officer Aaliyah said, her voice clear and completely unwavering as she handed the heavy silver pendant directly to the commanding policeman. This device contains a continuous, unedited high-definition recording of the last 45 minutes. It clearly documents my estranged husband Braden Kensington violently locking that front door, physically confiscating the only set of keys, and screaming that he would not allow me to leave this apartment. It documents him calling my father and explicitly threatening my physical safety in a desperate attempt to extort massive corporate financial concessions. My father did not break into this home to commit a random assault. He breached that door to rescue me from active unlawful imprisonment and a blatant documented hostage situation. Braden attacked him first, and my father simply defended himself. The commanding officer looked at the silver pendant, then pulled a digital viewing tablet from his utility belt. He plugged the recording device directly into the data port. The other officers gathered around the screen and watched the undeniable crystal-clear footage of Braden's manic, highly illegal extortion attempt. They watched him aggressively trap my daughter inside the penthouse. They watched him charge at me completely unprovoked, and they watched me neutralize him with one clean defensive maneuver. The video evidence was absolute and entirely bulletproof. The commanding officer turned off the viewing tablet. He did not look at me. He walked directly over to Braden, who was still sitting on the hardwood floor rubbing his sore shoulder. "Stand up and turn around," the officer ordered sharply, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You are under arrest for felony, unlawful imprisonment, attempted extortion, and domestic menacing." The sharp, heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping tightly around Braden's wrists echoed loudly through the silent penthouse. Richard stood completely frozen in sheer, unadulterated horror, forced to watch his only son being read his Miranda rights and hauled away like a common street thug. The spectacular arrest of Braden Kensington did not humble Richard. Instead, it pushed his panicked desperation into absolute overdrive. With his son sitting in a county jail cell and his logistics empire facing imminent foreclosure, Richard decided to deploy his final, most corrupt political favor. He manipulated Mayor Thomas into calling an emergency hearing at the city council. The agenda was a blatant, highly illegal abuse of municipal power. Richard was officially petitioning the city to declare the Eastside Commercial Industrial Park a zone of critical economic instability. He wanted the council to invoke the law of eminent domain. His absurd proposal demanded the city forcefully seize my entire commercial property portfolio under the guise of public security, claiming Vanguard Holdings was an absentee landlord destroying local commerce. He intended to have the city confiscate my land and immediately reassign the commercial deeds directly to his logistics company to save the regional supply chain. It was a staggering display of aristocratic entitlement. He stood at the center podium in the Grand Council chamber wearing a fresh tailored suit, projecting the false confidence of a civic savior. He looked at the council members, fully expecting his expensive political donations to yield a swift, favorable vote. I did not wait for the mayor to officially invite a rebuttal. I stood up from the back row of the public gallery and walked down the center aisle. The heavy thud of my boots echoed loudly in the cavernous municipal chamber. Jonathan Pierce walked one step behind me, carrying a massive reinforced steel briefcase. Richard gripped the edges of the wooden podium, his knuckles turning white as he watched me approach. He expected me to argue about property rights. He expected a standard legal debate over zoning ordinances and commercial lease agreements. He was entirely unprepared for the sheer volume of destruction I was about to unleash. I stepped up to the secondary microphone, looking directly at the deeply compromised mayor and the rows of silent city council members. "I am Carlton Richards," I announced, my voice projecting with absolute unwavering clarity. "I am the sole owner of Vanguard Holdings, the very entity Mr. Kensington is attempting to unlawfully seize, but I am not here today to debate the merits of eminent domain. I am here to expose a massive, highly coordinated cover-up that directly threatens the health and safety of every single citizen in this municipality. I unlatched the steel briefcase. I pulled out 3 thick, heavily bound dossiers and slammed them down onto the wooden podium. The sheer weight of the documents made a loud, echoing crack that startled the entire room. I did not present financial ledgers or tax returns. I presented certified, time-stamped ecological surveys, classified soil sample analyses, and hundreds of internal corporate memorandums legally procured during Jonathan's forensic audit. For the past 10 years, I stated staring coldly at Richard, whose face had instantly lost all color. The Kensington Logistics Company has actively avoided millions of dollars in highly regulated hazardous waste disposal fees. They did not transport their toxic mechanical runoff, highly corrosive battery acids, and industrial chemical solvents to approved treatment facilities. Instead, under the direct written authorization of Richard Kensington, they systematically pumped those lethal toxins into secret, unlined underground storage tanks buried directly beneath their primary distribution warehouse. When those illegal tanks reached maximum capacity, his management team authorized night crews to illegally trench the concrete foundation and bury thousands of gallons of toxic sludge directly into the raw earth. The council chamber erupted into a chorus of shocked gasps and frantic whispers. The mayor shifted nervously in his high-backed leather chair, realizing the radioactive nature of the political scandal he had just willingly invited into his own building. Richard tried to interject, stammering wildly into his microphone, claiming the documents were entirely fabricated and calling me a desperate liar. I completely ignored his pathetic outburst and opened the first dossier displaying high-resolution, subterranean thermal imaging photographs. The evidence was irrefutable. It showed a massive, glowing plume of chemical contamination spreading outward from his corporate headquarters, like a highly aggressive cancer. I turned my attention fully to the council members, raising my voice to cut through the rising commotion in the chamber. This is no longer a simple matter of a commercial lease dispute or distressed corporate debt. I explained, maintaining a hard clinical precision. The toxic chemicals Mr. Kensington has been secretly burying for a decade have not remained contained beneath his facility. The thermal imaging and soil toxicity reports confirm that his illegal chemical runoff has actively breached the bedrock. It has seeped directly into the subterranean water table. He has systematically poisoned the primary groundwater aquifer that supplies fresh drinking water to the entire eastern residential district of this city. I pointed a firm accusatory finger directly at Richard. This is not a municipal zoning violation. This is a catastrophic Class 1 felony violation of the Federal Clean Water Act and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. By knowingly dumping hazardous industrial waste to cut corporate operating costs, Mr. Kensington has engaged in severe environmental terrorism. The required ecological remediation alone will cost upwards of $50 million. He did not come to this council today to save the regional supply chain. He came here attempting to use eminent domain to forcefully transfer the legal liability of his toxic wasteland onto the taxpayers of this city before his crimes were officially discovered. He wanted the city to steal my land so he could bury his guilt under the guise of public utility. The documents sitting in front of you contain his personal digital signatures authorizing these illegal dumping schedules. They contain the forged environmental compliance certificates his company submitted to the state board year after year. The sheer level of ecological destruction he has orchestrated is unprecedented in this region. He has irreparably damaged the soil, endangered thousands of working-class families who rely on that specific water reservoir, and created an ecological dead zone that will take decades to properly decontaminate. The magnitude of this federal crime completely supersedes any municipal authority this council holds. Richard grabbed his microphone, his hands trembling so violently he knocked over his glass of water. It shattered across his podium. "This is an absolute outrage!" Richard screamed, his voice reaching a shrill, hysterical pitch. "These reports are entirely falsified. This man is conducting an illegal corporate espionage campaign. I demand this council hold him in contempt and proceed with the property seizure immediately." The mayor slammed his wooden gavel repeatedly, desperately trying to restore order to the chaotic chamber, but it was entirely too late. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance of the council chamber were violently thrown open. A team of 6 federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters EPA printed across their backs marched into the room. They were heavily armed and moved with strict, highly coordinated tactical precision, completely bypassing the local municipal security officers. They were flanked by 2 senior investigators from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had not just brought the environmental reports to the city council. Jonathan Pierce had simultaneously forwarded the entire unredacted dossier to the regional director of the Environmental Protection Agency 72 hours prior. The lead federal agent walked straight down the center aisle and approached Richard's podium. He did not ask for permission to speak. Richard Kensington, the agent, announced, his voice echoing with absolute federal authority. You are under arrest for severe criminal violations of the Federal Clean Water Act conspiracy to commit environmental fraud and mass illegal dumping of hazardous industrial materials. Richard stepped back, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He looked at the mayor, silently begging his corrupt political ally for salvation. But the mayor immediately looked away, completely severing his ties to the sinking ship. 2 federal agents flanked Richard, aggressively pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of federal handcuffs echoed through the silent council chamber. The arrogant aristocrat who had tried to steal my property was physically dragged away from the podium in front of the entire city government, utterly destroyed by his own toxic greed. Richard Kensington's highly paid defense attorneys managed to secure his temporary release on a massive $10 million bond. They leveraged the very last unseized assets his extended family possessed to buy him a brief taste of freedom, pending his federal trial. However, returning to the outside world offered him absolutely no comfort. In the 48 hours he spent sitting in a holding cell, Vanguard Holdings had completely dismantled his empire. His logistics company officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy liquidation. His corporate headquarters was permanently padlocked by federal marshals. His country club memberships were aggressively revoked, and his high society friends completely abandoned him, refusing to take his calls. He was a ruined man, stripped of his wealth, his prestige, and his power. The crushing weight of his absolute failure finally drove him to a state of pure, unhinged madness. It was shortly past midnight on a Thursday. A heavy, relentless rain pounded against the roof of my quiet suburban home. I was not asleep. The sudden deafening crack of a gunshot violently ruptured the midnight silence. The massive pane of glass comprising my front living room window exploded inward. Thousands of sharp, jagged shards rained down onto the hardwood floor, glittering briefly in the dim light of the street lamps outside. The violent intrusion was meant to induce absolute terror. It was meant to make me cower in fear. It failed completely. I did not flinch. I did not dive behind the sofa or scramble for the telephone. I was already sitting quietly in my favorite vintage leather armchair in the far corner of the darkened living room. I held a freshly brewed mug of black coffee in my right hand. The steam rose slowly in the cold, damp air now rushing in through the shattered window. I took a slow, measured sip, allowing the dark roast to warm my throat as I watched the pathetic spectacle unfold before me. Richard clumsily hauled his body through the broken window frame. He tore his expensive trousers on the jagged glass remaining in the sill, tearing the fabric and drawing blood, but he did not seem to feel it. He stumbled heavily into my living room, his boots crunching loudly over the debris. He reeked of cheap whiskey and wet wool. His hair was plastered to his forehead by the rain, and his face was a swollen, chaotic mess of rage and profound intoxication. He raised his right arm, swaying slightly as he struggled to maintain his balance. In his hand, he gripped a heavy silver revolver. He pointed the barrel directly at the center of my forehead. "You took everything from me," Richard slurred, his voice thick with alcohol and venomous hatred. His chest he heaved as he struggled to focus his bloodshot eyes on my silhouette in the shadows. "My company is gone. My son is in a county jail cell. My entire legacy is completely destroyed because of you. You are nothing but a parasite who crawled out of the dirt to steal what rightfully belongs to my family. I am going to end this right now. I am going to blow your head off and take my life back." The heavy metallic click of the revolver echoing in the quiet room was supposed to be the ultimate statement of his dominance. He wanted me to beg. He desperately needed to see the same crippling fear in my eyes that had consumed his entire existence over the past month. He wanted me to drop to my knees and plead for my life. I remained entirely motionless. I slowly lowered my coffee mug and rested it on the wooden side table next to my chair. I looked at the silver barrel of the gun, then shifted my gaze up to his frantic, terrified eyes. "You do not have the stomach for this, Richard," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying no anger, no panic, and absolutely no fear. You are a man who pays other people to do your dirty work. You hire lawyers to intimidate your rivals, and you bribe politicians to bury your crimes. You have never fought a real battle in your entire pathetic life. You are a coward pretending to be a killer. Richard screamed an incoherent curse, stepping closer, desperately trying to project a lethal menace. But his body language betrayed his absolute lack of conviction. His arm was shaking so violently, the barrel of the gun bobbed erratically in the dark. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees. "Before you attempt to pull that trigger, I suggest you look down at your weapon," I instructed calmly. "You are so drunk and so consumed by panic that you did not even disengage the safety mechanism. The lever is still fully locked in the safe position. You could squeeze that trigger until your finger breaks, and that gun will not fire a single bullet." Richard instinctively glanced down at the side of the revolver, his eyes widening in sudden, humiliating realization. He fumbled clumsily with his thumb, desperately trying to push the heavy metal safety catch downward. His hands were slick with rain and sweat, rendering his fine motor skills completely useless. "While you struggle with that, let me explain the legal reality of your current situation." I continued, my voice cutting through his frantic fumbling. "We are standing in my private residence. You have violently breached my front window. You are holding a firearm. Under the strict parameters of this state's stand your ground law. I am legally facing an imminent deadly threat from an armed home invader. That statute gives me the absolute, unquestionable legal right to reach into the drawer of this side table, pull out my registered, fully loaded .45 caliber handgun, and end your life right here on my living room rug. I would be entirely justified. The police would commend me for defending my property, and you would be buried as a violent, deranged criminal. But I am not going to shoot you, Richard. Death is a release. It is a quick, merciful exit from the consequences of your actions. I refuse to grant you that mercy. I want you to live a very long, very conscious life. I want you to wake up every single morning in a concrete cell, acutely aware that you destroyed your own empire." Before Richard could finally snap the safety off or process the crushing weight of my psychological dismantling, the distant wail of police sirens pierced the rainy night. The sound rapidly amplified, accompanied by the harsh, sweeping flashes of red and blue emergency lights illuminating the rain-soaked street outside my house, my home security system. The very same system Aaliyah and I had upgraded months ago featured an acoustic glass brake sensor. The moment Richard fired that initial shot through my window, a silent, high-priority distress signal was automatically transmitted directly to the local police precinct. The flashing lights flooded through the shattered window, painting Richard's terrified face in alternating shades of crimson and blue. The reality of his catastrophic mistake crashed down upon him with the force of a falling building. He was currently out on a $10 million federal bail. Committing an armed, violent home invasion while awaiting trial for severe federal environmental crimes was the absolute ultimate violation of his release conditions. The judges would instantly revoke his bail without a second thought. He had just guaranteed that he would never see the outside of a maximum security federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. The silver revolver slipped from his numb, trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a heavy metallic clatter, landing harmlessly among the broken glass. The arrogant patriarch, the man who had demanded I pour him coffee, the man who had threatened to ruin my daughter, physically collapsed. His knees buckled and he dropped to the floor. He buried his face in his hands and began to weep. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was the loud, guttural, pathetic sobbing of a completely broken entity. Armed tactical officers stormed through the shattered window frame, weapons drawn, shouting commands. They found me sitting calmly in my armchair, and they found the great Richard Kensington kneeling in the dirt and the glass, weeping uncontrollably as they aggressively forced his hands behind his back and locked the heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. The spectacular liquidation of the Kensington estate at the public auction left Braden with absolutely nothing. Stripped of his trust fund, his luxury penthouse, and his unearned prestige, reality hit him with the force of a freight train. He managed to secure a temporary release from county jail only because his mother drained her remaining personal savings to post his bail. But freedom without money is just a different kind of prison. He was completely unemployable in the corporate world. His highly publicized arrest for federal bank fraud made him radioactive to any legitimate business. Desperation drove him back to the very place his family used to rule. I was standing on the loading dock of the central warehouse reviewing renovation blueprints when Braden walked up the concrete ramp. He was not wearing a tailored designer suit or an expensive watch. He wore cheap, ill-fitting denim and a faded t-shirt. He looked entirely broken, his shoulders slumped and his arrogant swagger completely erased. He stopped a few feet away from me, swallowed hard, and looked down at his cheap work boots. He asked me for a job. He begged for manual labor, admitting he could not afford to eat and had absolutely nowhere else to go. I looked at the young man who had tried to steal my daughter's financial future and extort my family. I could have easily called security and had him escorted off my property for trespassing, but throwing him out would have been entirely too merciful. The best way to punish an entitled aristocrat is to force them to experience the grueling, exhausting reality of the working class they spent their entire lives looking down upon. I slowly rolled up my blueprints and tucked them under my arm. I told Braden that I did indeed have an open position available, but it was not in management, and it certainly was not in the air-conditioned corporate offices he was accustomed to occupying. I walked him to the far back perimeter of the industrial park, directing his attention to the massive cordoned-off excavation site. Heavy machinery was currently tearing up the thick concrete foundation where his father had illegally buried thousands of gallons of toxic chemical waste. The environmental remediation process mandated by the strict federal government guidelines required intense, highly dangerous manual labor to physically extract the contaminated soil surrounding the ruptured underground tanks. I turned to Braden and outlined the exact terms of his employment with cold, clinical precision. "You will be working directly in the hazard zone," I explained, pointing at the deep, foul-smelling crater that radiated intense heat. "You will wear a heavy, suffocating hazmat suit for 10 grueling hours a day under the blazing sun. You will physically shovel the highly toxic sludge your father created into reinforced disposal barrels using your bare hands. You will not receive executive benefits, you will not receive a corporate expense account, and you will not receive any special treatment or breaks. You will be paid the absolute federal minimum wage, and taxes will be aggressively deducted from every single paycheck to pay for your ongoing legal restitution. If you are late by a single minute, you will be fired immediately. If you complain about the heat, the overwhelming smell of the chemicals, or the intense physical exhaustion, you will be fired on the spot." Braden stared at the massive pit of chemical waste, his face turning a sickly shade of pale green. The sheer magnitude of the physical labor required was completely alien to him. He had never lifted anything heavier than a silver pen or a crystal whiskey glass in his entire privileged existence. His hands were soft and completely unaccustomed to real work, but he was utterly trapped by his own catastrophic failures. He had no safety net, no family fortune to fall back on, and massive looming legal fees hanging over his head. His survival depended entirely on the grueling, back-breaking labor I was offering him. He could either shovel toxic dirt or starve in the streets. He slowly nodded his head completely, surrendering his last shred of false pride, and whispered that he accepted the position. Before Braden could walk toward the staging area to collect his protective gear, I held up my hand. I told him there was one final, non-negotiable condition to his employment at this facility. I called over the new site supervisor tasked with managing the hazardous remediation crew. A tall, broad-shouldered black man with silver hair and a stern, weathered face walked over holding a heavy metal clipboard. His name was Kendrick. 5 years ago, Kendrick was the senior logistics manager for Richard Kensington's company. He was a brilliant, highly dedicated employee who had caught wind of Richard's illegal dumping scheme and attempted to report it to the proper authorities. Richard did not just fire Kendrick to silence him. He used his corrupt municipal influence to completely blacklist Kendrick from the entire regional shipping industry, falsely accusing him of stealing valuable inventory to utterly ruin his professional reputation and his livelihood. I had specifically tracked Kendrick down, cleared his name entirely, and hired him to run the daily operations of this entire facility. I looked at Braden, whose eyes widened in absolute horrifying recognition as he saw the man his family had ruthlessly destroyed. "Kendrick is your direct supervisor," I stated, my voice echoing with poetic, undeniable justice. "You will refer to him exclusively as Sir. You will follow every single order he gives you without hesitation or complaint. Your continued employment and your physical survival rest entirely in his hands." Kendrick looked down at the former heir to the Kensington Empire. He did not gloat or raise his voice. He simply handed Braden a heavy steel shovel and pointed toward the toxic pit. "Get to work," Kendrick ordered smoothly, his voice carrying the heavy weight of long-awaited vindication. Braden put on a plastic hazmat suit and slowly descended into the mud, forced to clean up his family's toxic legacy under the strict authority of the very man his father had maliciously tried to destroy. While Braden was sweating in the toxic dirt, my daughter was officially finalizing the total erasure of his presence from her life. The divorce proceedings were swift, brutal, and completely one-sided. Because of the irrefutable, legally binding video confession Braden had signed in the bank regarding his attempted financial fraud, his highly paid defense attorneys had absolutely zero leverage in family court. The presiding judge was deeply disgusted by his actions. Aaliyah retained 100% of her premarital assets, her private townhouse, and her immaculate credit score. She walked out of the courthouse completely unburdened and victorious, while Braden was permanently shackled to his own profound financial ruin. With the son utterly neutralized and performing manual labor in my mud, the desperate focus shifted entirely back to the father. Richard Kensington was currently sitting in a federal detention center, his temporary bail officially revoked after his disastrous drunken assault on my home. He was facing over 2 decades in a federal penitentiary for the environmental terrorism and the armed home invasion. His legal defense team, operating on the very last fumes of his hidden offshore accounts, formally reached out to Jonathan Pierce. They requested an urgent private meeting at Jonathan's downtown law firm. They were waving a white flag of total unadulterated surrender. They wanted to aggressively negotiate a comprehensive plea deal to significantly reduce Richard's impending prison sentence. They promised full cooperation, access to hidden offshore assets, and anything else I demanded in exchange for my leniency regarding the civil damages and the property destruction charges. They thought they could still bargain their way out of total destruction. They thought the game was still about money, corporate leverage, and high society settlements. Their arrogant assumption that wealth could buy them a way out of consequence was about to be permanently shattered. They were about to learn that when an arrogant predator attacks my family and my daughter, there is no negotiation, no financial settlement, and absolutely no mercy whatsoever. Jonathan Pierce and I sat quietly on one side of the massive conference table at his downtown law firm. Sitting directly across from us were 3 of the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in the state. They looked completely exhausted, sporting deep dark circles under their eyes and nervously shifting in their expensive chairs. They knew they were fighting a completely unwinnable battle, but they were being paid handsomely from the very last of the Kensington offshore accounts to try one final desperate maneuver. The lead defense attorney leaned forward, adjusted his silk tie with a trembling hand, and slid a crisp white folder across the polished wood. He spoke in a hushed, highly confidential tone, offering what he genuinely believed was an irresistible proposition. He explicitly promised that Richard Kensington's hidden trusts would immediately wire a staggering sum of money directly into my holding company accounts. They were offering to pay me exactly 3 times the estimated cost of the environmental remediation, plus massive personal damages for the home invasion. All I had to do in return was formally withdraw my civil lawsuits, sign a global non-disclosure agreement, and formally petition the federal judge for extreme leniency regarding the toxic waste charges. They were attempting to buy their client out of a federal prison sentence. I looked down at the crisp white folder resting on the table in front of me. I did not reach out to open it. I did not even lean forward to inspect the specific astronomical numbers they had carefully typed out on the contract. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I slowly raised my gaze and looked the lead defense attorney dead in the eye. The room fell so completely silent that you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. "You completely misunderstand the fundamental nature of this conflict," I said, my voice projecting a cold, unwavering, absolute authority. "You walked into this room operating under the pathetic assumption that every single man has a price. You think because your client spent his entire life buying his way out of consequences, he can simply purchase a get-out-of-jail-free card when he finally crosses the wrong line." I reached out with one single finger and slowly pushed the white folder back across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of the lawyer. "I do not want Richard Kensington's money. His money is toxic. It is built on fraud, exploitation, and the literal poisoning of this community. I do not need a financial settlement. I am already a remarkably wealthy man. What I need, and what I will absolutely ensure happens, is total accountability. Your client did not just default on a commercial lease. He systematically pumped hazardous industrial chemicals into the local groundwater because he was too cheap and too arrogant to follow basic federal regulations. When he was caught, he did not apologize. He attempted to extort my daughter with fabricated evidence. He tried to weaponize the local government against my legitimate business. And when all of his pathetic schemes failed, he got heavily intoxicated, drove to my private residence, shattered my front window, and pointed a loaded firearm directly at my head. Men like Richard have existed for generations. They sit in their country clubs and their luxury penthouses entirely convinced that their bank accounts elevate them completely above the law. They believe the justice system was designed strictly to punish the working class while fiercely protecting the wealthy elite. I stood up from my leather chair, towering over the highly paid legal team. I am going to correct that delusion today. The law was designed to protect society from predators no matter how expensive their tailored suits are. I will not sign a single non-disclosure agreement. I will not withdraw a single civil charge. I am going to proudly take the witness stand in federal court, and I am going to testify under oath to every single crime your client committed. I am going to make absolutely certain that the legal system crushes him exactly the way it crushes a common violent street criminal. This meeting is officially over. The federal sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later in a heavily guarded, packed courtroom. The gallery was filled to absolute capacity with local journalists, environmental activists, and the angry citizens whose drinking water had been severely jeopardized by the illegal corporate dumping. I sat in the very front row wearing a crisp, perfectly tailored navy blue suit watching the final act of this spectacular downfall. Richard Kensington sat at the defense table. He looked absolutely unrecognizable. The arrogant, booming patriarch was completely gone. He was gaunt, his skin a sickly gray, and his posture was entirely defeated. He trembled visibly as the federal judge addressed the court. The judge, a stern, unforgiving woman with zero tolerance for corporate corruption, delivered a scathing, merciless rebuke of Richard's actions. She systematically listed his crimes, reading the charges aloud for the public record with profound disgust. She highlighted his blatant, malicious disregard for the environment, his aggressive conspiracy to commit federal bank fraud alongside his son, and the violent armed home invasion that violated his strict terms of release. She explicitly stated that his massive wealth and his prior high society standing were not mitigating factors but rather aggravating elements that highlighted his profound, unadulterated greed. He had every advantage in the world, and he still chose to operate like a ruthless criminal. The heavy wooden gavel fell with a loud, decisive, echoing crack. The judge sentenced Richard Kensington to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Because the charges included severe federal environmental terrorism and violent firearms offenses, the judge explicitly ruled that there would be absolutely no possibility of early parole or sentence reduction. He would serve every single day of those 15 years behind thick concrete walls. The collective gasp of shock from his few remaining supporters in the gallery was immediately drowned out by the harsh metallic clinking of heavy chains. 2 large, heavily armed federal marshals stepped forward immediately. They forcefully grabbed Richard by the arms, hauling his limp body up from the defense table. They secured thick steel cuffs around his wrists and fastened a heavy transport chain around his waist. As they led him away from the bench and down the central aisle toward the holding cells, the courtroom fell into a heavy, dramatic silence. His shuffling footsteps echoed loudly against the hardwood floor. As Richard passed the front row, he suddenly stopped. The marshals tugged aggressively on his chains, but for one brief, agonizing second, Richard turned his head and looked directly at me. I stared right back into his eyes. The vicious, entitled monster who had told me I did not belong in his world at the rehearsal dinner was completely dead. His eyes were entirely shattered. They held nothing but an empty, vast, bottomless void of absolute ruin. He had finally realized that his blinding arrogance had cost him his company, his son, his freedom, and his entire life. I did not offer him a smug smile. I did not utter a single word of gloating victory. I simply held his hollow gaze until he physically looked away, completely unable to bear the heavy weight of his own profound humiliation. The marshals jerked his chains hard, breaking the trance, and led him out of the courtroom doors, disappearing forever into the dark federal corridor. I stood up calmly, adjusted my suit jacket, and walked out of the federal courthouse. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the bright, warm afternoon sunlight. I took a deep, cleansing breath of fresh air. The toxic element had been permanently removed from my city and my family. I walked down the concrete steps toward my waiting truck, my mind immediately shifting gears. The war was officially over. Now it was time to drive back to the East Side Commercial Industrial Park, clear out the hazardous wreckage of the past, and begin rebuilding a thriving, clean, and entirely new empire. The grinding, high-pitched screech of industrial power saws cutting through heavy steel echoed across the East Side Commercial Industrial Park. I stood on the pristine new concrete of the loading dock holding a thermos of black coffee in the crisp morning air, watching the absolute physical erasure of a toxic dynasty. High above the main warehouse facility, a crew of specialized demolition workers suspended from a massive yellow crane were dismantling the towering weathered letters that spelled out Kensington Logistics. The rusted metal bolts gave way with loud, violent snaps. One by one, the massive steel letters were ripped from the building's facade and lowered unceremoniously onto a waiting flatbed disposal truck. They hit the truck bed with a heavy, hollow clatter, sounding exactly like the final nails being driven into Richard's coffin. For 3 generations, that sign had loomed over this industrial sector as a beacon of unearned aristocratic pride and systemic exploitation. Now it was nothing more than highly contaminated scrap metal destined for the local recycling furnace. The skyline was finally clean, physically purged of their poisonous, arrogant presence. The ground was fully remediated, the toxic soil had been completely excavated, and the foundation was completely rebuilt. The physical demolition of their legacy was merely the prelude to the spectacular resurrection I had planned. 8 months of grueling, relentless construction and millions of dollars in highly calculated investments completely transformed the decaying property. The site of Richard's criminal environmental disaster was meticulously reborn into a state-of-the-art gold standard model of sustainable commercial infrastructure. The roof of the massive warehouse was now completely covered in advanced high-efficiency solar arrays. The loading bays were equipped with cutting-edge electric vehicle charging grids, and the entire facility operated with a verified zero-emissions carbon footprint. It was a masterpiece of modern, eco-friendly logistics. The grand opening ceremony attracted a massive crowd of regional investors, influential industry leaders, and a swarm of local journalists, eager to cover the highly anticipated resurrection of the city's primary shipping hub. A large stage draped in sharp emerald green fabric was set up directly in front of the main facility doors. A sleek midnight black luxury sedan glided smoothly onto the freshly paved asphalt and parked right next to the red carpet. The driver quickly stepped out and opened the rear passenger door. Aaliyah stepped out into the flashing array of press cameras. She did not look anything like the devastated, betrayed woman who had wept in a bank manager's office. She looked like an absolute, untouchable titan of industry. She wore a razor-sharp, perfectly tailored emerald green executive suit that radiated fierce, undeniable authority. Her posture was completely rigid, her chin held high, and her gaze projected a terrifying, quiet power. She walked confidently up the steps to the main podium, completely commanding the attention of every single person in the massive crowd. I stood proudly in the front row, watching my brilliant daughter take absolute control of her destiny. She grasped the edges of the wooden podium and delivered a flawless, commanding speech, outlining the innovative, sustainable vision of her brand-new enterprise, Apex Green Logistics. She did not mention the Kensington family by name, but every promise she made about corporate transparency, environmental integrity, and ethical business practices served as a lethal, unspoken condemnation of their toxic failures. She officially cut the thick green ceremonial ribbon with a pair of oversized golden scissors, formally launching the multi-million-dollar corporation. The crowd erupted into deafening, enthusiastic applause. She had officially taken the helm of the empire. Watching her shake hands with high-profile investors and field rapid-fire questions from financial reporters, my chest swelled with a profound, overwhelming paternal pride. Aaliyah's transformation over the past year was nothing short of breathtaking. She had completely refused to let Braden's vile betrayal or Richard's racist extortion define her life. She did not shrink into the shadows or play the role of the broken, traumatized victim. Instead, she weaponized her pain, forging it into an impenetrable suit of corporate armor. She utilized her elite architectural background to personally design the entire eco-friendly retrofit of the warehouse facility. While I provided the initial startup capital from Vanguard Holdings, Aaliyah did the grueling heavy lifting. She ruthlessly negotiated the new vendor contracts, navigated the incredibly complex federal environmental compliance laws with lethal precision, and personally recruited a top-tier management team. She had absorbed the harsh, brutal lessons of corporate warfare that the Kensingtons had forced upon her, and she had emerged as a formidable apex predator in the business world. She learned that true power does not come from a prestigious last name or a fake country club membership. True power is cultivated through undeniable competence, absolute resilience, and the sheer relentless capacity to outwork your enemies. She was no longer just an architect. She was a supreme, highly respected chief executive officer leading her own massive enterprise with empathy for her workers, but governing with an absolute iron fist. At the far edge of the vast, freshly painted parking lot, standing completely outside the glittering perimeter of the glamorous press event, was Braden. He was wearing a heavy neon orange industrial worker's uniform, heavily stained with dark engine grease, and the foul residual dirt of his grueling manual labor. He leaned heavily against the wooden handle of a coarse push broom, his bare hands heavily calloused and blistered from months of physical punishment. His face was deeply sunburned, dripping with exhausted, filthy sweat under the afternoon sun. He stood frozen by the commercial dumpsters, looking through the cheering crowd of wealthy investors and snapping cameras staring directly at the raised emerald podium. He watched his former wife, the woman he had cowardly attempted to manipulate, extort, and financially destroy, standing at the absolute pinnacle of commercial power. She was now the supreme boss of the massive corporation that legally owned his family's lost territory. Braden stared at her radiant, commanding presence as the harsh, unforgiving reality of his permanent situation crushed whatever microscopic shred of ego he had left. He realized with an agonizing absolute finality that he was nothing more than a nameless hourly laborer sweeping the asphalt of her kingdom. Aaliyah's dark eyes briefly scanned the cheering crowd and momentarily landed on him standing in the distant shadows. She did not sneer. She did not offer a vindictive smirk. She did not show a single ounce of emotion. She simply looked right through him as if he were entirely invisible, treating him like an insignificant speck of dust on her pristine property. She turned her attention back to the flashing cameras, continuing her brilliant, unstoppable ascent. Braden slowly lowered his head, his shoulders violently slumping in total, inescapable defeat. He gripped his broom with trembling hands and silently went back to sweeping the dirt. The absolute order of the world had been flawlessly, permanently restored. The conflict was completely and unequivocally over. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the worn wooden planks of my front porch. I sat in my favorite rocking chair listening to the quiet, rhythmic creak of the wood against the floorboards. This was the exact same modest, single-story suburban house where Valerie and I had started our lives together. It was the same house where we had celebrated Aaliyah's first steps, her high school graduation, and every quiet victory in between. I could have easily bulldozed this property decades ago and erected a sprawling multi-million-dollar compound with high concrete walls and private security. I had the liquid capital to buy the entire neighborhood 10 times over, but I chose to stay. This house was my anchor. It was a daily physical reminder of the grit, the struggle, and the absolute foundation of love that built my empire. Months ago, Richard Kensington had stood on this very porch, sweating with desperate panic, and treated my home like a filthy slum. He had aggressively thrown a stack of cash onto my front lawn, genuinely believing that his depreciating wealth elevated him above the sanctity of my property. Now the man who had looked down his nose at my humble domain was confined to an 8x10 concrete cell, while I sat comfortably in the gentle evening breeze, the absolute master of my peace. The autumn air carried a sharp, biting chill as the sun finally dipped below the horizon. I stood up, walked inside, and locked the solid oak front door. I moved into the living room and knelt in front of the brick fireplace, striking a long match to ignite the stacked oak logs. As the flames began to crackle and catch, I walked over to the kitchen counter to sort through the small stack of afternoon mail. Wedged between a utility bill and a real estate prospectus was a stark, plain white envelope. The return address was stamped in bold, impersonal black ink. It bore the official seal of the United States Federal Bureau of Prisons, followed by a specific facility location and a 9-digit inmate identification number. The name printed directly above that number was Richard Kensington. I held the envelope in my calloused hands. It felt incredibly light, yet it carried the heavy, pathetic weight of a completely broken man. I did not need to tear open the seal to know exactly what was written on the lined prison paper inside. I knew the exact tone he would use. It would be a sprawling, desperate manifesto of fabricated remorse. He would write pages upon pages begging for my forgiveness, pleading for me to contact the federal parole board to advocate for a sentence reduction. He would falsely claim he had found clarity behind bars, that he recognized the errors of his profound arrogance. He might even attempt to leverage some twisted appeal to my humanity, asking for financial assistance for his destitute wife, Diane, who was likely living in a tiny rented apartment on the edge of town. He would try to manipulate me one last time, hoping that the passage of time had softened my resolve. He was completely wrong. I did not harbor any lingering anger toward Richard. Anger requires energy, and he simply was not worth another fraction of a second of my time. He was no longer a rival. He was a ghost. I walked slowly back into the living room and stood directly in front of the roaring fireplace. The orange flames licked aggressively at the stone chimney, casting dancing shadows across the hardwood floor. I did not open the envelope. I did not read a single word of his desperate, groveling apologies. I simply extended my arm and dropped the sealed letter directly into the center of the blazing fire. I stood there with my hands resting comfortably in my pockets, watching the bright white paper instantly curl and brown from the intense heat. The edges caught fire, illuminating the federal stamp one last time before the entire envelope was consumed by the flames. It turned into brittle black ash, breaking apart and floating up the dark chimney chute. Richard Kensington's final pathetic attempt to reach into my world was permanently reduced to nothing. His legacy was gone, his empire was repurposed, and his voice was completely silenced. The sound of a familiar engine pulling into the driveway broke the quiet hum of the burning fire. The front door opened and Aaliyah walked into the house. She had shed the sharp, intimidating emerald green executive suit she wore to the ribbon-cutting ceremony. She was dressed in a simple, comfortable cashmere sweater and soft denim jeans. The formidable apex corporate predator had temporarily clocked out, leaving only my daughter returning home to share a quiet evening with her father. She carried 2 tall glasses of freshly brewed iced tea with lemon slices resting on the rims. She walked over to the fireplace, handed me a cold, sweating glass, and sat down on the plush leather sofa next to my armchair. We sat in comfortable, profound silence for several minutes, watching the last remnants of the oak logs pop and spark in the hearth. The heavy, exhausting weight of the past year, the brutal betrayal, the intense corporate warfare, the relentless legal battles had completely evaporated. We had navigated the absolute worst of human greed and arrogance, and we had emerged completely victorious entirely on our own terms. Aaliyah took a slow sip of her iced tea and looked over at me, her dark eyes reflecting the warm, dancing light of the fire. "The logistics hub is running at full capacity," she said softly, a gentle, genuine smile playing on her lips. "We secured 3 major national distribution contracts this afternoon. The environmental regulators gave us a flawless rating. We completely stabilized the ground they tried to destroy." I nodded, looking at the brilliant, resilient woman sitting beside me. "You did that, Aaliyah. You built a fortress out of the wreckage they left behind. I simply handed you the tools." She shook her head slightly, staring into the flames. "I used to think that the world they lived in, that entire society of inherited wealth and country clubs, was something impenetrable. When Braden first brought me into his family, they made me feel like I was intruding on sacred ground. They made me feel small." I shifted in my leather chair, leaning forward to look her directly in the eyes, ensuring my final words would cement themselves permanently in her mind. "Money cannot buy respect. Aaliyah," I said, my voice steady, carrying the absolute weight of almost 70 years of hard-fought wisdom. "It can buy expensive suits, massive houses, and the temporary illusion of power. But the moment real adversity strikes, all of that fragile armor shatters. Richard and Braden had all the money in the world, and they were the weakest men I have ever encountered. True respect is not handed to you in a trust fund. Respect is forged in the fire. It is built by knowing exactly who you are and exactly what you stand for. When desperate, arrogant people try to strip absolutely everything away from you, they tried to take your dignity, your future, and your name. And you did not break. You stood your ground, and you conquered them. That is true power." Aaliyah looked at me, letting the profound truth of those words settle deeply into her soul. The lingering shadows of Braden's betrayal and Richard's toxic cruelty completely vanished from her eyes, replaced by a radiant, unshakable peace. She set her glass of iced tea down on the wooden side table. She shifted closer, wrapped her arms around my neck, and leaned her head gently against my shoulder. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, her voice filled with absolute, unwavering love. I rested my hand on her shoulder, holding her close as the fire slowly burned down to glowing red embers. We had protected our family. We had protected our legacy. And we had reminded the world that the most formidable power does not hide behind a gated mansion. It sits quietly biding its time, ready to strike when provoked. The screen slowly fades to black. Let this story serve as a final reminder that you should never judge the depth of a river by the stillness of its surface. The loudest person in the room is almost always the weakest, driven by a desperate need to prove a worth they do not actually possess. True power does not need to shout. It does not need to belittle others to elevate itself. It moves quietly, observes patiently, and strikes only when necessary. When you encounter arrogance disguised as superiority, do not let it intimidate you. Stand firm in your own truth, because the most magnificent empires are often built by the hands of those society chose to overlook. If you enjoyed this story of justice and resilience, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments below.